South Pacific, 1943. The struggle for the Solomon Islands has become a grinding war of attrition. It is a battle fought over vast stretches of open ocean and steaming jungle islands, where the heat and malaria are enemies as deadly as the Japanese Zeros. In this theater, victory depends on air superiority, and the United States Marine Corps is throwing a new breed of fighter into the fray. To conquer these skies, American industry produced a machine of terrifying power, the Vought F4U Corsair. To the enemy, it is the whistling death. To the Marines who fly it, it is the ensign eliminator, a beast that demands respect. Its distinctive inverted gull wing design was born of necessity, not aesthetics. The engineers needed to mount the largest propeller ever attached to a fighter plane, and the bent wings provided the necessary ground clearance without requiring landing gear that was too long and fragile for carrier decks. It is a paradox of aviation history that this very design feature, intended for Navy carriers, initially made the aircraft too difficult to land on a moving deck. The long nose blocked the pilot's view, and the landing gear had a tendency to bounce. Rejected by the Navy for carrier duty, the Corsair found its home with the land-based Marines. Here, on crushed coral runways carved out of the jungle, the 2,000 horsepower double Wasp engine could finally be unleashed. But a machine is only as good as the men who fly it, and in the chaotic reinforcement shuffle of the Pacific War, a unique unit was forged. Assembled from replacements, pool pilots, and veterans who had no squadron to call their own, they were a scratch unit. They did not fit the mold of the polished parade ground officers. They were rugged, independent, and led by a commander who was decades older than most of his men, a man who had already flown and fought with the Flying Tigers in China before America even entered the war. These men lived in tents, fought in the air, and survived on sheer grit. They developed tactics that utilized the Corsair's blistering speed and dive performance to counter the agile Japanese fighters. They flew long, exhausting fighter sweeps, often outnumbered, relying on teamwork and aggression to clear the skies from Rabaul to Bougainville. What you are about to see is the record of that time. It is a look at the machinery of war and the human spirit that drives it. From the roar of the radial engines on a tropical morning to the desperate dogfights high above the clouds, this is the story of how a group of so-called misfits became one of the most effective fighting forces in the history of naval aviation.
From September 1943 to January 1944, the Black Sheep Squadron flew bold and highly successful operations in the skies above the Solomon Islands. Under the leadership of the colorful Major Gregory Boyington, the Black Sheep Squadron earned quite a reputation for their distinctive style and impressive record.
Pilots live a different kind of a life. They're not on the beach, Omaha Beach, with bodies all around them. They go out on a mission, and when they come home, they count the people who come back, and you got an empty bunk. But it's a lonely experience, and it happens.
It's hard to describe, how close you are to your buddies out there. And then when somebody didn't come back, it used to upset me that they go to his bunk and distribute his toothpaste and shaving gear and all that stuff like, oh, yeah, he's gone.
By noon on January 3rd, 1944, he was missing in action. As one report stated, the war stood still for 100 pilots and 500 crewmen. Everybody, including the press, waited for the return of Marine Corps Major Gregory Boyington. Boyington was only 1 kill away from tying the United States all-time ace record. Could someone have bettered Boyington? What would the Black Sheep do without Pappy?
He wasn't a role model on the ground, but I thought he was a role model in the air. Yeah, he made young men brave. He was a real leader in the air.
How many pilots have you ever heard of who on their first combat mission in the Solomon Islands, where we were, shot down 5 planes on one mission?
His leadership wasn't only morale, but tactically he was a very fine leader and inspiration with his own conduct in combat. He had all these frailties that go with being an alcoholic, but he was to us, he was a fine squadron commander.
He even gave a talk to them one time and said, look, I'm just like coach, and this is a big football team, and we all got to work together to make this thing happen. And I think that was what inspired them most of all, just because he was a down-to-earth person and basically led by example in the airplane.
They came from everywhere, from New England to New Orleans, from Florida to California. They had never trained together. In fact, no one planned to put them together. These were Boyington's bastards, Pappy's Black Sheep. The Black Sheep Fighter Squadron and their speedy Corsairs tormented the Japanese in the Solomon Islands. The squadron is credited with 126 destroyed, with another 34 probable, all of this in just 12 weeks. The squadron's success started at the top with their unusual squadron leader. He was raised Gregory Hallenbeck, born on December 4th, 1912. His home was a small lumber town in western Idaho. Living in a frontier community with alcoholic parents left Gregory with a lot of free time.
And he and his little buddies frequently would go on adventures, climbing cliffs. If there was a tree that he wanted to climb, he would invariably find the tallest tree, and to that you would add the fact that it would be on the side of a cliff, so he could climb as high as he could. He would do things like climb grain elevators and walk a beam from one grain elevator to the other over the railroad tracks, just to challenge himself and make himself sort of a hero amongst his young friends.
In the fall of 1919, a barnstormer in his surplus Jenny biplane flew into Gregory's little town. This was the first plane he had ever seen. Gregory, with one of his fellow first graders, convinced the pilot to give them a ride. Of all his flights, this one would always be remembered. As a young man, Gregory moved to Seattle, got married, and began working as a draftsman for the Boeing Corporation. He was quickly bored with his job and began looking for a way out. Ignoring the regulation that no Marine cadet could be married, Greg applied for training. While looking for his birth certificate, he learned that there was no record of a Greg Hallenbeck being born on December 4th, 1912. Finally, his mother confessed that he really was not Gregory Hallenbeck. She had divorced his father when he was very young. His real name was Gregory Boyington. The new name worked in Greg's favor. Officially, Greg Boyington was not married, and therefore eligible for Marine cadet training in Pensacola, Florida. Recruits who entered Pensacola in the 1930s received some of the finest flight training available. For Boyington, the flying was the only good part. Hiding his wife and children turned out to be an expensive endeavor. Cadets made little money. His unofficial family expenses and ever-growing bar tab proved too much to handle. Boyington was broke.
So that by the time World War II was starting to approach, he was financially very heavily in debt. And by now he had 3 children, and his marriage was on the rocks, and the situation was fairly gloomy. And he had been in some hot water with the Marine Corps, to the point that he could see the handwriting on the wall that he would be furloughed or cashiered fairly soon.
One night in the summer of 1941, Boyington went into the San Carlos Hotel in downtown Pensacola. He cashed a bad check for $20 and proceeded to the bar. Soon he learned that a recruiter upstairs was looking for fighter pilots for hire who would help defend the Burma Road against the Japanese. Boyington met with the recruiter and immediately saw a way out of his gloomy financial situation. Within a matter of days, Boyington steamed to Burma with the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. For Boyington, the decision was easy. The pay was 3 times his Marine salary, and the Chinese government was giving a $500 bonus for each plane shot down.
Probably the Marine Corps were as glad to see him go as he was glad to be able to get away from his debts and other obligations.
In February 1940, Japan moved troops into Indochina and began expanding into China. Under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, China desperately sought ways to halt the Japanese aggression. The Chinese Air Force was not adequately equipped with modern aircraft, but it was fortunate to have serving as a military advisor Claire Chennault. Chennault, a retired Army captain and stunt flying team member, moved to China and assembled the American Volunteer Group. The American Volunteer Group was split into 3 squadrons. 1 squadron was sent to defend Rangoon, and 2 others were sent to southern China to defend the Burma Road. Immediately, the AVG successes stunned the Japanese and forced them to reinforce their squadrons operating in the Chinese theater. Though he contributed to the Flying Tigers' success, Boyington really never fit in. He was the man they left alone.
Boyington's reputation did precede him somewhat. He had this reputation as a boisterous, rowdy, two-fisted drinker amongst some of the Navy pilots who had gone ahead of him, Navy and Marine Corps both. And when he got there, a lot of that reputation played out.
First time I ever saw Pappy, Moose Moss and I were in this little town of Tungu, which is about 8 miles out of where our base was there in central Burma. And so we were in this little town there, and we heard this racket. We were rooting around somewhere there, and we heard this racket, and we jumped back kind of off the side of the road in a little kind of a path. And here comes this damn rickshaw. Pappy's pulling the rickshaw and got the coolie in the sitting in it, drunk as a goat, you know.
At times, he would report to work the next morning, and he wasn't capable of flying, and I was in operation, so I'd take him off the scramble list and take him off alert. Bob Neal finally got fed up with him, and things went from bad to worse.
Boyington left the Flying Tigers abruptly and without permission, angering Chennault and his fellow Tigers. He made his way to India.
Chennault fired a message to the Air Force in India denying Boyington air passage back to the United States. In fact, urging them to recruit Boyington into the Air Force as a second lieutenant. So Boyington bought passage with the hard-earned money that he had been paid on an American ship, the SS Brazil.
Although the Allies gained an edge in the Battle of Midway, Boyington learned upon his return home that it had been a disaster for the Marine Corps' fighter squadrons. The Marines had already lost a good number of their planes and top pilots at Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Wake Island. Boyington thought this critical need for Marine fighter pilots would guarantee his speedy return to service. He was wrong.
In the meantime, he went back to his home state of Washington, where his father and his mother lived. I should say his stepfather and his mother were living. And he waited for the Marine Corps to call him back to service. And he waited some more. He had 3 children to feed. and no work, and he ended up going to Seattle and working in a parking garage. During World War II, while everybody else was training or going overseas to fight, he was parking cars.
One night, Boyington took matters into his own hands. After drinking a bottle of bourbon, he sat down and wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. Boyington claimed he was an ace with the Flying Tigers, and that all he wanted was to be reinstated in the Marine Corps so he could fight. To expedite matters, Boyington called Western Union and read his letter as a telegram to Washington, D.C. Remarkably, within a matter of days, Boyington was reinstated in the Marine Corps, now as a major, and once again went off to war. What his responsibilities would include, who knew, but at least he would be closer to the fight. Boyington soon found out flying was not part of his future. He was passed from one group to another, usually as an administrator. The few opportunities he had to command a squadron rarely involved flying time, and he did not encounter opposition from the enemy. This was not what Boyington had in mind. Finally, in desperation, he went to see an old friend, a senior officer named Sandy Sanderson. They came up with the idea of forming a fighter squadron by using pilots available in the replacement pool. Somehow, the idea got approval. Boyington was allowed to assemble together fighter pilots, and what would become the Black Sheep Squadron was formed.
When they formed the 214 around Boyington, and we all got together, it was a comradeship, and it's hard to describe.
We had a pretty good cross-section of experience, so that, we weren't a bunch of new boys on the block, and I think that made it possible to weld together very quickly.
We had a good record in that Solomon's campaign, but I'm sure many of the other squadrons with whom we fought had comparable records. And sometimes you might think we won the war by ourselves.
We did.
The squadron fell under the leadership of Boyington and Frank Walton, the intelligence officer. Walton was the stabilizing force behind the squadron. A police officer in Los Angeles, Walton was tough enough to keep Boyington and the gang in line. Walton was also a dedicated writer who committed himself to keeping the families back home informed.
Walton, after you were all there at night, he'd be in the office, and he'd be writing press releases. And he'd send press releases to the Times-Picayune, where I lived in New Orleans. Man, my parents thought I was the biggest hero in the war.
I think that Frank was very compassionate, and I know that he agonized when a big flight would go off, 16 planes on a sweep over Bougainville or something like that. He was concerned that every single one of us get back.
Soon after the squadron was authorized and began their training, they decided that they needed their own identity and their own name. And because of the nature of their formation, that it was informal and that they had been brought from different units, some had experience, some didn't, the first name they hit on was Boyington's Bastard.
The day it was decided, we were all in a tent, or quite a few guys were in a tent, and we played around with Boyington's Bastard and kind of liked it. But then the PR guy that was with us said, you might do some good, and that wouldn't go too good in the press. And so they compromised and made a Bastard shield for us in order to keep the Bastard but not have it in print. And it served pretty well, and we liked it.
In heraldry, the stripe, the black stripe, is called the bar sinister, and it's a symbol of illegitimacy.
Though the Solomon Islands only fill a small part of the Pacific Ocean, their strategic location became critical for both the Japanese and the Allied forces. The United States Marines helped stop the Japanese advancement at Guadalcanal. The Allied strategy was to take the offensive and island hop from Guadalcanal towards Tokyo. When the Black Sheep arrived, the Japanese stronghold at Bougainville was under constant attack. Once captured, Bougainville would serve as a staging area for attacks against the Japanese fortress at Rabaul, which housed over 100,000 troops, 4 airstrips, and over 400 aircraft. Given the speed in which the squadron was put together, Boyington spent what little time he had explaining tactics and strategy to his men. Many of his pilots came with no combat experience, and only a few had flown together.
Pappy's explanation of how he wanted the squadrons to operate, how the divisions would operate, was standard. It was not strange. Everybody fell into it very nicely. We'd brief each other before we go up so that my wingmen knew what I was going to be doing and how my hand signals and so forth were going to work, and the same with the section, so that I never had a feeling that we were not a unit. I think that was the great thing about 214.
Boyington also spent time explaining the difference between the Marines' F4U Corsair and the Japanese Zero. "You're flying one of the sweetest fighters there is," Boyington once told his squadron. "But there are certain things a Corsair won't do." Boyington knew the Zero was nimble and could outturn the Corsair. The only way to win was to attack from above.
Boyington had learned fighter tactics while flying with the AVG, where they had learned that none of the American planes could turn inside the fighters that the Japanese had. The Zero and even the earlier predecessors to the Zero were incredibly nimble. They had lightning quick response. They could out-climb anything that the Americans could put in the sky. So they quickly learned the tactics to use were to get above the Japanese, use the superior weight of the American fighter, and come down on the enemy, open fire with a quick burst. And this is where the American fighters had a distinct advantage. With 6 heavy machine guns in the wings, they could just make a veritable buzzsaw of lead that would tear apart those lightly built Japanese planes.
With the knowledge they had managed to gain from Boyington and others in the squadron with experience, and with their Corsairs, the Black Sheep Squadron set out to leave their mark on history. On September 16, 1943, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Boyington and 23 Black Sheep took off for their 3rd combat mission. This would be a day to remember. The Black Sheep were escorting a bombing mission against a Japanese base on an island near southern Bougainville. As they approached the target, they met a powerful force of Japanese fighters. A dogfight ensued, and for 30 minutes, within 250 square miles of airspace, Zeros and Corsairs maneuvered against each other. On this day and many to come, the Black Sheep ruled the skies. They claimed 11 victories and another 8 probables. Boyington got 5 himself. The Black Sheep's success continued. Day after day, the squadron scored kill after kill. The fighting instincts of the squadron commander worked well with the pilots at hand. Boyington and his boys became known as one of the most aggressive and successful fighter squadrons in the region. But with these victories came the sad reality of losing a colleague. No one looked forward to the time when a death was officially recorded. Like all others stationed in the Solomon Islands, the Black Sheep dealt with military life in a jungle. Living on an undeveloped Pacific island was a difficult adjustment. Conditions were sparse, and as squadrons moved further up the islands and new bases were quickly established,
we just were always wet. And one of the things that bothered us is that we'd been in that flight suit for day after day and probably didn't rinse them out as often as we should. I was never terribly impressed with the gourmet cooking, although I really had no problem. I like Spam, I liked it then, I still like it, and I managed to handle powdered eggs, so that wasn't a real problem.
Miserable.
I thought the food was the worst problem. Yeah. Spam and Vienna sausage, and they rotated. One for breakfast, one for the other for lunch, and a third for noon. And then they'd repeat it, they would change it slightly the next day, and instead of having Spam for breakfast, you'd have Vienna sausage for breakfast.
However, life wasn't that bad. Mosquitoes, yes. Heat, yes.
You can put up with a lot when you're 20, 22 years old.
Sure.
Though his methods were often questioned, Boyington instilled an incredible sense of camaraderie in the squadron. He was able to meld the group into a unit. For a fighter squadron, trust among fellow pilots is absolutely essential.
I'm depending on my wingman to cover my tail while I cover his. And you can't do it if you have animosity against them. It just can't be done. And that goes for your second section. There, we're weaving, we're doing everything you can to protect each other while we're trying to get the enemy. And it all starts back on the base where you had to learn to live together.
Living with Pappy Boyington was challenging. He burned the candle at both ends, working all day and playing all night. At times, his drinking was uncontrollable.
I just said, Pappy has to have some kind of release, and this is it. It doesn't distract from what he's doing in the air, that's obvious. Although I wasn't one that joined into that myself. That's just the way it was, and life went on.
One of his characteristics is that when he drank, he frequently became belligerent. He was a fighter. He loved to wrestle. He didn't care who he fought, but he would frequently challenge somebody to a fight when he drank. Invariably, he picked the biggest guy around. This also extended to his skill as a pilot. He loved to fight. He was aggressive. It didn't matter if he was fighting his own people or fighting the Japanese. He had that fighting mentality.
One of our first meetings, we were sitting around after dinner, and Boyington said, "I'll fight anybody in the place." And turned his head to Frank Walton, who was a big, tough old LA cop and our intelligence officer. He said, "Except Walton." And that is the way he fought. He fought to win, and he fought all the time. He loved it. He loved it. Thank God he did.
Boyington regularly demonstrated his fighting instincts in the air. Each time he climbed into a Corsair, his squadron knew what to expect. Find the enemy's weakness and attack.
Boyington would catch them taking off. That's when they were most vulnerable. The brass used to try to force the fighters to stay close to the bombers. And staying close to the bombers, you could fend off the attacking Zeros, Japanese, but you couldn't get a kill. They would pass through, rip off a few rounds at the bombers, and then dive out back towards Indian country. Boyington would carry the attack to the enemy planes, taking off, climbing out, when they were highly vulnerable.
Even the Japanese learned of Boyington's passion for fighting. On one particular fighter sweep over Bougainville, the Japanese decided not to come up when challenged by the American fighters. Boyington got mad and yelled over the radio, "Come on up and fight." To the surprise of everyone, the Japanese radio operator responded, "Why don't you come down, Major Boyington?" The third week in October saw the end of the Black Sheep's first tour. In just 6 weeks, the squadron scored 57 confirmed kills and another 19 probables. The Sheep were tired and in need of a break. They had listed 4 pilots missing or dead and sent 2 more away due to injuries. The remaining 22 were ready for some rest and relaxation in Sydney, Australia.
And then after each combat tour, which is usually around somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks, you'd go back to Espiritu Santos and they'd load you up on a bunch of DC-3s and they'd fly all night well, you stopped at New Caledonia, then down to Sydney, Australia.
When you landed, you immediately made a beeline for King's Cross, which was sort of the bohemian section of Sydney, and you found yourself starting off probably at the Red Cross Hostel, and then working out from there to find some convenient place to call your headquarters.
The first time I was there, I stayed in the Royal Australian Hotel. I'll never forget that place as long as I live. Boyington was there too. We never saw him though, except at the parties at night. I don't know what he did during the day, but he had fun. We all did.
The ground rules were such that it was pretty much open season. The Marines come into town, we'd find some delightful young lady to help us enjoy our rest and recreation. One of the great things about the Hotel Australia in downtown Sydney was it had a long mahogany bar, and the center section was reserved for Marines. Frida was the bartender behind that particular section.
There was this one Frida that everybody went to, and you'd line up in front of Frida before the bell rang, and you'd order, and she was allowed 1 bottle of scotch a night, if I remember. And you got there early, you'd order 4 scotches, and she'd put the glasses out there with all the scotch and stuff in them. And then when the bell rang, you'd grab your drinks and poured them down as fast and went back and ordered some bourbon or whatever was there.
I can remember when we get ready to come back, we'd go by and buy a chicken that had already been cooked. We'd carry that back because flight rations on the way back were not exactly up to airline standards, so this would help us a great deal. So we'd usually eat the chicken and then sleep the rest of the flight.
The Black Sheep's return to combat began with a controversy surrounding their beer-filled luggage.
We carried our gear in a parachute bag, canvas parachute bag, and before taking off for resuming our flight back to the islands, we had to carry it in and have it weighed so they could figure in this non-flying officer there said you got too much weight, and we suspected he may have been looking for some of the beer that we were carrying back with us. Don't know, but we argued without success. Boyington argued without success, and then turned to us and said, "Drink the beer, boys," and we left the bottles.
Full of pleasures and memories of Sydney, the Black Sheep flew back to the Solomon Islands. They knew what lay ahead. The Allies had moved up the islands, and the final push to Rabaul was just beginning. New pilots were added to the squadron, bringing the total to 40. Boyington spent the first weeks explaining to the new pilots how the Black Sheep fought. Soon, word came that the squadron was returning to combat, but unfortunately, without Boyington. A longtime nemesis of Boyington, Colonel Joe Smoke, had transferred Boyington away from the fighting to a non-flying job. Smoke was military proper and did not approve of Greg Boyington. The two men detested each other. On Frank Walton's recommendation, Boyington went over Smoke's head and secretly visited an old drinking buddy, General James Moore, at headquarters. Moore could not argue with Boyington's success and granted him another combat tour.
And when Smoke learned of this, he was so incensed that he dredged up a very obscure regulation in which officers were not allowed to go to group headquarters on their own business. And using this regulation, Smoke had Boyington arrested and put him in hack for a couple of weeks, meaning that he was confined to his own quarters or to the environment of Turtle Bay airstrip. And he was not allowed to visit the clubs. And before the completion of his so-called sentence, Boyington got on a transport with several of his other pilots and just went to begin another combat tour.
During their second tour, The Black Sheep confirmed their suspicions regarding the importance of fighter strafing raids. Guns loaded with armor-piercing incendiary slugs could slice the forest and any Japanese hotspots in the way. The Black Sheep found themselves lending a hand to the ground Marines who were fighting intense Japanese opposition. The assistance was greatly appreciated. In reports filed by ground Marines, references to the irrepressible Black Sheep began to appear.
Well, at one time, I was sitting on a ready alert at the end of the runway in case some Japanese plane came in, and some of the ground Marines came out of the bush and were saying, in effect, you guys do the greatest job. What we were doing was firing at the guns that they had put up in the hills to pop down on us. He says, you are saving our lives, and I just can't believe what you're doing. And my answer to him was that we're in awe of you. We wouldn't anymore want to go back in the bush and fight the way you do. You do, both of us do, what we're trained for.
As Bougainville became secured, the Black Sheep knew that soon they would be fighting over the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. The Japanese were determined to maintain their position at Rabaul, because if it fell, then the only choice the Japanese had was to retreat to the Philippines. At Rabaul, the Japanese had 5 airfields full of aircraft ready to provide heavy opposition to Allied attacks. The Marines knew the casualty rate over Rabaul was going to be high. After being summoned to the Air Command headquarters, Boyington learned that he would be leading an 80-plane strike against Rabaul. This initial raid was disappointing for the Black Sheep because the Japanese were intimidated by the enormous size of the American force. They sent up only a few aircraft and kept the rest of the Zeros safely on the ground. During the next few weeks, the story was different. The Japanese were better prepared. Sortie after sortie, the Black Sheep applied pressure to the Japanese. They escorted numerous B-24 bomber runs, and they unleashed a series of Boyington's deadly fighter sweeps. The fighting was rough and the casualties were high. In 1 week alone, the Black Sheep lost 6 pilots. As the squadron's number of kills increased, so did Boyington's personal tally. He was getting close to the all-time ace record.
The attention in the United States was focused on this so-called victory race. At the time, the leading ace of all of the American forces was Joseph Foss, who had scored 26 credited victories during the defense of Guadalcanal, mostly in 1942 and the first few weeks of 1943. So he was the leading ace with 26 victories. Boyington started to approach that number, and almost every time he went flying, the media would crowd around upon his return to find out how he had done that particular day.
As the story unfolded, more and more press arrived, wanting to cover the story of his record-breaking flight. Good news about the war was a rare commodity, and Boyington's story was every pressman's dream, a self-made man, an outsider, moving into sacred territory. Boyington was not as sure. As the squadron approached the end of the second tour and the number of days available to break the record became fewer, Boyington began doubting his chances. In a letter he wrote to his mom, Boyington confessed, "The Japanese are getting pretty tough out here. I don't know whether I will be able to break Joe Foss's record before I go home or not. As you have always taught me, nothing is worthwhile unless you earn it." Early in the morning on January 3rd, 1944, Boyington met his squadron on the airstrip at Torinquina. He had nothing to drink the night before and had slept well. On this day, Boyington was taking his sheep on a large fighter sweep of Rabaul. As they approached the coast, the Black Sheep met an enormous number of opposing Japanese planes. A dogfight ensued, and Boyington and his wingmen found themselves alone with at least 20 Zeros. Boyington did what he could. A number of Black Sheep witnessed Boyington shoot down a Zero, but then dramatically disappear. There was no sign of his wingman either. No one could believe what had happened. By afternoon, most people figured Boyington was not returning. Earlier, angry pilots had climbed into their Corsairs and gone looking for Boyington, shooting up anything Japanese along the way, but they found nothing. There was no story for the press, no happy ending. Major Boyington was gone. Perhaps Frank Walton expressed the loss of Boyington best when he wrote to his wife, "We all miss the skipper, but even more important than our personal loss is the loss to combat aviation. Someday I can tell you more, but he was the dean of all combat pilots. We loved him and respected him, and our boys were all willing to die for and with him. And some of them did, but I'm sure they considered it an honor to do so." For the next months, rumors spread like wildfire. There were claims that Boyington was alive, hiding in a jungle waiting for his men to pick him up. Others believed Boyington had taken a submarine home and was already back in the States. There was also a story that someone had found Boyington's Mae West life jacket riddled with bullet holes. Without their leader, the Black Sheep had little chance of remaining together. They were finished as a group. By January 9th, they had completed their second tour and were relaxing on Turtle Bay, enjoying swims during the day and movies at night. They would soon be disbanded and sent to different assignments. The Sheep had every reason to be proud of the squadron's performance. They were credited with 94 confirmed planes shot down, another 35 probably shot down, 50 aircraft damaged, and 21 destroyed on the ground. The total was 203 enemy planes destroyed or damaged. They had also lost 12 pilots while reaching this mark. The squadron's name and number was given to a new squadron training in the United States. This group was to be given little chance to continue the legacy created by the original Black Sheep. The role of a Marine fighter squadron had changed by the time the new Black Sheep were deployed. They now operated from carriers, and VMF 214 was stationed on the USS Franklin. Tragedy on a grand scale awaited the squadron. On March 19, 1945, the Franklin was within 100 miles of the Japanese coast. Before dawn, 12 Black Sheep departed for a fighter sweep, leaving the remaining pilots and crew on board. A single Japanese Judy dive bomber slipped through the radar and dropped 2 bombs on the deck of the Franklin. The carrier erupted. Rescues were made when they could be, but the intense fire and constant explosions prevented many attempts. 7 pilots were pulled from the water, and another 5 were declared missing. 26 squadron crew members were also dead. There was no reason to consider a future for the squadron. Those pilots who could still fly were sent to other squadrons, and the rest were sent home. The Black Sheep Squadron was disbanded and would not return for a number of years. As the war in the Pacific drew to a close, prisoners of war were being released, and as it turned out, some stray sheep were found. Major Gregory Boyington was alive and in good health at the Omori prison in Tokyo. On the day Boyington disappeared, he had jumped from his aircraft and was picked up out of the water by a Japanese submarine. He was taken from prison to prison and ended up in one outside of Tokyo.
And here the prisoners were put to work walking across the causeway every morning to clear the rubble from the streets after the B-29 raids the previous night. And again, they were underfed, they were often beaten. The Japanese performed experimental surgeries on certain prisoners, and it was a rough existence for all of them. But in August of 1945, a small fleet sailed into Tokyo Bay after the Japanese had surrendered. And Hal Stassen, who had been a former governor of Minnesota, was one of the first people to greet Greg Boyington and the other Omori prisoners. And then they were brought aboard a hospital ship, given delousing and showers and hot meals. And then eventually Boyington was flown back to the United States, where he received a hero's welcome.
Word soon spread that Pappy Boyington was alive.
Out in the Pacific, on one occasion, he said, if you see me shot down over a ball and bail and go smashing into the ocean, don't worry about it. I'll meet you at the Sir Francis Drake and have a drink after the war. And he made good on it.
The world listened to Pappy's incredible story.
Somehow or other, they found all the black sheep in the country, and the Marine Corps arranged transportation and flew us all out to San Francisco and put us up at the
St. Francis.
St. Francis. And they had a 3-day party there. I've still got a hangover from it.
After the party, the Marine Corps sent Boyington and Frank Walton on a cross-country tour selling war bonds. In every community he visited, Boyington received a hero's welcome, and in Seattle, the city closed the streets. The war bond tour ended with a visit to the White House, where Boyington was joined by fellow Black Sheep as he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Truman, a fitting end to the Black Sheep's legacy. The Black Sheep today are reserved when asked to tell their history. As far as they are concerned, a Hollywood movie and a 1970s television series based on their experiences did not tell their story. What it was like to be 20-something years old, flying and getting shot at during the day, and sleeping in a jungle at night. So today, the Black Sheep keep their story private. They know what they did, and they know why they did it.
Well, I don't think that special mention should be made of the Black Sheep. We were one of many squadrons who fought the War of the Solomons with some success, and it gave us great satisfaction because we developed under the pressures of flying combat friendships for which there is no replacement.
I'm proud of the squadron. I'm proud to have been a member of it, even for a short period of time.
I'm not going to apologize for the Black Sheep Squadron. It was a hell of a good outfit, great people, longtime friends, and we did our job, and we ought at least be credited with that. I will not take second place to anyone. Yeah, he made young men brave. He was a real leader in the air. The day it was decided, we were all in a tent, or quite a few guys were in a tent, and we played around with Boyington's Bastard and kind of liked it. But then the PR guy that was with us said, you might do some good, and that wouldn't go too good in the press. And so they compromised and made a Bastard shield for us in order to keep the Bastard but not have it in print. And it served pretty well, and we liked it.
In heraldry, the stripe, the black stripe, is called the bar sinister, and it's a symbol of illegitimacy.
How many pilots have you ever heard of who on their first combat mission in the Solomon Islands, where we were, shot down 5 planes? on one mission. Well, at one time, I was sitting on a ready alert at the end of the runway in case some Japanese plane came in, and some of the ground Marines came out of the bush and were saying, in effect, you guys do the greatest job. What we were doing was firing at the guns that they had put up in the hills to pop down on us. He says, you were saving our lives, and I just can't believe what you're doing.
But tactically, he was a very fine leader and inspiration with his own conduct in combat. Boyington would catch them taking off. That's when they were most vulnerable. The brass used to try to force the fighters to stay close to the bombers. And staying close to the bombers, you could fend off the attacking Zeros, Japanese, but you couldn't get a kill.
And we all got to work together to make this thing happen. And I think that was what inspired them most of all, just because he was a down-to-earth person and basically led by example in the airplane. Soon after the squadron was authorized and began their training, they decided that they needed their own identity and their own name. And because of the nature of their formation, that it was informal and that they had been brought from different units, some had experience, some didn't, the first name they hit on was Boyington's Bastards. And when Smoke learned of this, he was so incensed that he dredged up a very obscure regulation in which officers were not allowed to go to group headquarters and on their own business. And using this regulation, Smoke had Boyington arrested. And here the prisoners were put to work walking across the causeway every morning to clear the rubble from the streets after the B-29 raids the previous night. And again, they were underfed, they were often beaten. The Japanese performed experimental surgeries on certain prisoners, and it was a rough existence for all of them.
First time I ever saw Pappy, Moose Moss and I were in this little town of Tungu, which is about 8 miles out of where our base was there in central Burma. And so we were in this little town there, and we heard this racket. We were rooting around somewhere there, and we heard this racket, and we jumped back kind of off the side of the road in a little kind of a path. And here comes this damn rickshaw. Pappy's pulling the rickshaw and got the coolie in sitting in it, drunk as a goat, you know.
At times, he would report to work the next morning, and he wasn't capable of flying, and I was in operation, so I'd take him off the scramble list and take him off alert. Bob Neal finally got fed up with him, and things went from bad to worse.
Walton, after you were all there at night, he'd be in the office, and he'd be writing press releases. And he'd send press releases to the Times-Picayune, where I lived in New Orleans. Man, my parents thought I was the biggest hero in the war.
I think that Frank was very compassionate, and I know that he agonized when a big flight would go off, 16 planes on a sweep over Bougainville or something like that. He was concerned that every single one of us get back.
In June of 1942, a pivotal naval confrontation unfolded, marking one of the most significant battles of World War II as the United States of America faced off against the Japanese Empire. Fought exclusively with aircraft carriers positioned hundreds of miles apart, the Battle of Midway represented a groundbreaking naval conflict. It marked the inaugural major fleet engagement where opposing fleets never closed the gap to visually spot each other's ships. Victory or defeat depended not on the big guns of battleships, but on the carrier-borne bombers and torpedo bombers flying over vast tracts of ocean to seek and destroy their targets. Midway was the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. The Battle of Midway held paramount significance for Japan, as it was envisioned as the pivotal element in a grand strategy aimed at expanding the empire's territorial reach deep into the Pacific. Midway Island, a crucial American stronghold, was slated for assault and occupation, while the United States Pacific Fleet, en route to defend it with its scarce aircraft carriers, would fall into an ambush, leading to its annihilation. Should the remaining vestiges of American naval might be ultimately shattered, Japanese dominance over the Pacific would remain unassailable for the foreseeable future. In fact, in the Battle of Midway, the Japanese carrier fleet, the mightiest in existence, was utterly destroyed, and Japan suffered her greatest defeat for over 300 years. During the Battle of Midway, Japan, at the zenith of its military strength, suffered not only a significant naval defeat, but also, in the span of a single day, sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire, leading it toward downfall and defeat. Since the early 1930s, Japanese conquests in China had caused ever-increasing friction with the United States. Starting in mid-1940, the United States imposed a prohibition on the export of arms, scrap iron, and other critical strategic resources to the Japanese Empire. Then, in July 1941, America led an international oil embargo and froze all Japanese overseas assets. The effect was devastating. Up to now, 90% of Japan's oil had been imported, and her stockpiles were rapidly dwindling. As time grew scarce, the Japanese leadership made a momentous choice to embark on invasions and conquests of neighboring regions abundant in oil and other essential raw materials. First, a major obstacle would have to be eliminated: the American Pacific Fleet, anchored at Hawaii. In the early hours just prior to dawn on December 7, 1941, a fleet of 360 bombers and fighters took off from Japanese aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of Hawaii. Their target was the 3 carriers and the 8 battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet, based in Pearl Harbor. In the span of just 2 hours, a total of 18 American warships, including 6 battleships, were sent to the depths, while an additional 90 vessels sustained damage from bombs or torpedoes. Almost 200 planes were destroyed on the ground, and over 3,500 U.S. personnel killed or wounded. The Japanese lost only 29 aircraft. It was a stunning victory. Shortly after noon the next day, the United States declared war on the Japanese Empire. Following the devastation of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the path was cleared for the Japanese campaign of expansion and conquest. In advance of the impending onslaught, garrisons across the region had covertly bolstered their defenses, and thousands of troops had been assembled and readied for action. In the hours following the Pearl Harbor raid, Japanese aircraft launched attacks on American air bases located at Wake Island, Guam, and Luzon in the Philippines. With complete air superiority, the Japanese launched their invasions. Forces in French Indochina, already held by the Japanese, rapidly advanced into Thailand and Burma. Troops from the island of Hainan landed in Malaya. On that very day, an initial raiding force commenced the invasion of the Philippines, swiftly followed by larger-scale landings. Over the next 3 weeks, Wake Island and Hong Kong fell to the Japanese. Borneo and Caleb were invaded, and Sumatra was occupied. On February the 19th, Japanese aircraft carriers launched a lightning raid on Port Darwin in northern Australia, sinking 12 merchant ships and eliminating Darwin as a valuable Allied base. Early March saw the climax of the Japanese expansion, the inevitable occupation of Java. In a little over 3 months, Japan had conquered 1/4 of the Pacific Ocean. By securing a stable oil supply and expanding the defensive perimeter around their homeland, Japan had successfully accomplished all of its immediate wartime objectives. Yet in spite of the breathtaking scale of the Japanese victories, there did remain one major threat to the security of her Pacific conquests. 3 aircraft carriers from the United States Pacific Fleet managed to elude the devastation at Pearl Harbor, and within a matter of weeks, each of them served as a central core for a newly formed task force. After minor raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, 2 of the American carriers set sail on one of the most audacious missions of the Pacific War: to bomb Tokyo, the heart of the Japanese Empire. In early April 1942, the aircraft carrier Hornet embarked on a westward journey from the U.S. naval base in Alameda, California, to meet up with its sister ship, the Enterprise, which was sailing from Pearl Harbor. With adept maneuvering to bypass the protective string of Japanese-controlled islands, both the Hornet and the Enterprise managed to penetrate to a point within 825 miles of Japan's coastline. At 8:24 on the 18th of April, 16 Mitchells took off from the Hornet and struck a course for the Japanese capital. Flying low, they avoided Japan's fighter defenses, and 15 aircraft dropped their bombs on the city. All but one of the Mitchells escaped to safety in mainland China or Russia. Following the attack, famously referred to as the Doolittle Raid, which took its name from its commander, Japanese military leaders were deeply alarmed and concerned. Even though the raid had inflicted only minor physical damage, it delivered a significant blow to Japan's sense of national pride. The need to protect the emperor was at the very core of the armed forces' being, and an agony of shame swept through the high command. Japan's leaders swiftly arrived at the conclusion that there was just one means by which they could ensure the adequate protection of homeland and the emperor. The frontiers of the empire must be pushed even further into the Pacific. In October 1941, General Hideki Tojo had been appointed Prime Minister of Imperial Japan. In his role as the Army Chief of Staff, Tojo harbored a profound ambition to witness the successful culmination of the Japanese campaign in China. He firmly believed that the sole path to achieving this goal was to secure a decisive victory over the Western powers. On his appointment as Prime Minister, General Tojo had kept his post as Chief of Staff and the job of War Minister. However, although an immensely powerful figure, Tojo did not have the complete control of government policy. Within a cabinet comprising representatives from all branches of the armed forces, he could rely primarily on the backing of the army. Consequently, most decisions ultimately resulted from a compromise between the army and the navy. Even prior to the Doolittle Raid, expanding the empire's boundaries into the Pacific had been a cherished aspiration of a powerful naval faction. After the raid, arguments between the army and navy evaporated. Because the proposed operation would demand little army participation, Tojo finally gave his support. Franklin D. Roosevelt had been elected President of the United States in 1932. Strongly against the prevailing sentiment of isolationism, Roosevelt had the conviction that America should actively engage on the global stage. Even before the outbreak of war in Europe, Roosevelt had warned of the dangers posed by Nazi Germany's ambitions. Following the German conquest of the continent in 1940, Roosevelt, despite facing domestic opposition, progressively bolstered his support for Britain in its battle for survival. It was also Roosevelt who, in relation for Japanese actions against China, had imposed the oil and trade embargo on Japan. As a former Assistant Secretary to the Navy and now its Commander-in-Chief, Roosevelt took a special interest in the service. He handpicked his own flag officers and staff members, driven by his unwavering belief that the Navy should be led by the most qualified individuals for the roles. In a testament to his commitment to competence, he appointed Frank Knox, a member of the opposition Republican Party, to head the Navy Department. Under Roosevelt and Knox, the naval budget steadily rose. Even following the events at Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt maintained a belief that ran contrary to the desires of the American public. He believed that a war in Europe should take precedence over actions in the Pacific. He understood that enormous resources would be needed to push back the tide of the Japanese conquest, and until the full might of American industry could be brought to bear, the United States would have to concentrate on holding the line. Roosevelt insisted that further Japanese expansion must be counted at all costs. The Imperial High Command anticipated that the expansion of the Japanese defense perimeter in the Pacific, while presenting logistical complexities, would pose minimal substantive challenges. On the islands to be invaded, enemy forces were weak, and at sea, it seemed there was little to fear from the Americans or the British. The Japanese Navy, the diving force behind the plan, was supremely confident. The first stage of the Japanese plan of conquest was to complete the occupation of New Guinea. As of April 1942, a portion of New Guinea had already fallen under Japanese control, and they were eager to prevent the Allies from gaining control over the entire island. An advanced striking force of troop transports and heavy cruisers would be assembled in Rabaul along with the 3 aircraft carriers of Truk. The forces from Rabaul would sail south, then split into 2 divisions. The first was to seize Laggy in the Solomon Islands. The second, supported by 1 aircraft carrier from Truk, was to capture Port Moresby. The remaining 2 carriers would enter the Coral Sea and engage any enemy found there. Once New Guinea had been occupied, then New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa would easily be captured. In order to expand the Japanese front in the northern region, 3 islands within the Aleutian chain, Attu, Kiska, and Adak, were slated for conquest. The next stage in the Japanese advance would be the occupation of the American-held island of Midway, 1,136 miles west of Hawaii. Seizing Midway would secure an airstrip for the Empire within a range that could threaten the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Although the capture of Midway would provide a vital stepping stone in any future action against Hawaii, the operation would also have another equally important objective. It would be used to lure American aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor and force them to fight a battle that would end in their destruction. The strategy for capturing Midway and defending the American carrier fleet was a multifaceted and intricate amalgamation of invasion, diversion, reaction, and ambush tactics. The first step in the Midway offensive would be the dispatch of a Japanese submarine fleet to set up to reconnaissance cordons, one 500 miles west of Pearl Harbor and the other between Hawaii and Midway. As the submarines assumed their designated positions, a Midway occupation force, comprising troop ships accompanied by a division of heavy cruisers, would depart from the Marianas and proceed northeast towards Midway. In order to incapacitate Midway's defenses and stage an ambush against the American carrier fleet, a formidable carrier strike force was organized, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers backed by battleships, heavy cruisers, and a robust destroyer screen. The carriers and their support would sortie east through the Bungo Channel. They would be followed by a main force of 6 battleships. In the northern region, a second task force comprising carriers and transports, escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and battleships, would launch an attack on the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutians' operation had a secondary purpose. It would divert the Americans from the impending attack on Midway, tempting them to send the carrier north. In order to intercept any U.S. warships dispatched from Pearl Harbor, the Japanese fleet would be strategically repositioned to lay in wait. To the south, the Japanese carrier strike force would approach within 250 miles of Midway and attack the airfield, hangars, and shoreline installations. The invasion would quickly follow. As the Midway landings were in progress, the carrier strike force and the main force battleships redeployed 500 miles from the island would lie in wait. Upon the departure of the American fleet from Pearl Harbor and their detection by the submarine surveillance perimeter around Hawaii, or the long-range reconnaissance patrols originating from the Marshall Islands, the Japanese carriers would move into engagement. The big guns of the main force battleships would then finish the remnants of American sea power in the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Navy code JN-25 had been partially broken by U.S. naval intelligence. However, the cipher was complex, and many messages still remained difficult to understand. Commander Joseph Rochefort was head of the Naval Communications Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor. It was Rochefort who finally succeeded in adding a piece of the cipher jigsaw, vital to the Midway operation. By early May, Rochefort had a strong suspicion that a major attack was being planned for Midway based on partially deciphered Japanese messages. However, obtaining confirmation was challenging, and alternative interpretations remained plausible. The code that the Japanese used to represent the island was unknown, but was supposed to be the letters AF. Rochefort designed a simple ruse, which was given the go-ahead by his superiors. prompting Rochefort to coordinate an urgent request from the island for a freshwater tanker. 2 days later, on the 12th of May, an American listening post picked up a Japanese radio message, AF is short of water. It was clear that the coded messages referring to an attack on AF meant that Midway was the true objective of Japan's coming operation. Already, the Japanese plan was fatally compromised. While the Americans would face a significant numerical disadvantage in the impending battle, the efforts of the codebreakers at Pearl Harbor allowed them to make a more precise estimation of the likely date of the attack, narrowing it down to a range between June 4th and June 8th. Knowing that the Japanese invasion of the Aleutians was merely a feint, the Pacific Fleet could afford to concentrate its strongest naval force in the Midway area. Moreover, being aware that Japanese aircraft carriers would be positioned in ambush, the Americans could disregard the invading forces and concentrate their efforts entirely on targeting the enemy carriers. The United States had a precise asset in the island of Midway itself. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and even B-17s could be stationed there to attack the Japanese fleet. As an unsinkable airbase, the island held immense value as a contingency landing strip for carrier-based aircraft that might be damaged or running low on fuel. In addition, Midway had 2 old but powerful radars, which could be used to help detect and track Japanese attacks. The United States naval strategy to counter the Japanese operation at Midway was meticulously crafted to leverage every advantage held by the Americans. The American defense of Midway would hinge on the ability of 2 carrier task forces to find and destroy the Japanese fleet. Task Force 16, based around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, would be the first to sail from Pearl Harbor. Task Force 17, with the carrier Yorktown, would follow 2 days later. All 3 carriers would rendezvous at Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. As the Japanese carrier strike force approached the area, the problem of the Americans would be finding it. The radar systems on American carriers had a limited range of 150 miles. If the carrier's own reconnaissance patrols couldn't establish contact, the fleet would need to depend on long-range aircraft stationed on Midway Island. Midway's reconnaissance Catalinas would fly 700 miles out to sea in search of the Japanese. In the event that the enemy fleet was detected, the Catalina aircraft would shadow it until it entered the range of the Midway radar station. Midway radar would then keep the pursuing American carriers fully informed. An all-out attack of land and carrier-based aircraft could then be accurately vectored in to destroy the Japanese strike force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the strategy to defeat the United States Navy at Midway, assumed the role of Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet in 1939. A dynamic and powerful personality, Yamamoto had little regard for the abilities of his superiors, and he was well aware that they were intimidated by his standing and his track record. Yamamoto's remarkable achievements as the orchestrator of the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent Pacific triumphs granted him significant latitude in formulating and executing offensive strategies. Yamamoto's resolve to have his strategies adopted was so unwavering that he often resorted to threatening resignation if his plans were not embraced. In his youth, Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University and, as a graduate, had served in Washington as naval attaché. Knowing the United States intimately, Yamamoto greatly feared America's industrial might. Prior to the events at Pearl Harbor, he had made efforts to persuade his superiors about the potential risks Japan would confront in a protracted conflict with the United States. However, once he realized that Japan was committed to war, Yamamoto was determined to win it, his way. The destruction of the American fleet at Midway would buy Japan much-needed time. Yamamoto's aspirations centered on the concept of the Kasen Kantai, the pivotal and conclusive battle that would compel the Americans to engage in peace negotiations. He understood that a fleet engagement was a reckless gamble, but as an inveterate poker and shogi player, he was convinced that the only possibility of a victory lay in staking everything on just one card. Admiral Chester Nimitz, a gifted strategist and organizer, had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet on the 31st of December 1941, immediately after the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor. Nimitz held the belief that the tragedy at Pearl Harbor was not attributable to incompetence, and his subsequent policy of keeping all officers in their positions significantly boosted morale within the American Pacific Fleet. Nimitz's personable style of management plus a remarkable gift for trusting subordinates to do their jobs without interference would prove crucial in the battle ahead. Following the Pearl Harbor attack, it was Chester Nimitz who recognized that the era of the formidable battleship armed with big guns was coming to an end. He understood that the future striking power of America's Navy would be centered around the aircraft carrier. While under Nimitz's direction, America's carrier building system was accelerated, for the moment, he would have to make do with what he had, just 4 aircraft carriers and their support ships. In spite of his slender resources, Nimitz would stick to the tactical doctrine he had always advocated. For aircraft carriers, attack is the best form of defense. To the Japanese Navy, the outcome of the forthcoming battle was never in doubt. So far, the war had yielded an unbroken string of successes, and the certainty of victory was shared by all ranks. The confidence was so high that some flag officers harbored a genuine concern that the Americans might be hesitant to engage in combat and choose to remain within the secure confines of Pearl Harbor. One advanced seaplane squadron even sent a signal to its headquarters, requesting that all future mail should be directed to Midway. The results of war games simulating the coming battle were also ignored. When a scenario of this nature led to the involvement of American bombers from Midway Island and the subsequent destruction of 2 Japanese carriers, the final outcome was deemed unacceptable and was overridden by the imperial authorities. For the massive undertaking that would expand the Japanese Empire and destroy the US Navy in the Pacific, Japan could muster almost its entire combined fleet. All 9 of the fleet's battleships, along with 11 carriers, could take part in the coming operations. Of these, 4 carriers eventually participate in the Battle of Midway. Akagi, or Red Castle, was laid down as a battlecruiser in 1920. 2 years later, she was converted into an aircraft carrier. In 1934, Akagi was extensively modified to accommodate 30 more aircraft, taking her battle complement to 91. Akagi was only one of 2 carriers ever built, with the bridge on the port side. Kaga, or Increased Joy, was originally laid down as a battleship, but in 1924, work began to convert her into a carrier. She was completed in March 1928. Later, Kaga's triple deck was replaced by a much lengthened single deck and a major refit. Her aircraft capacity was raised from 60 to 90. Soryu, the Green Dragon, was launched in December 1935. Built under the limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty, Soryu was small and cramped. Nevertheless, she could still carry 63 aircraft. And the design was so successful, she was the model for the nearly all later Japanese carriers. Hiryu, the Flying Dragon, like Akagi, had her bridge on the port side. Because of the universal tendency of pilots to veer to the left in emergency, the design caused many more landing accidents. Hiryu was, however, very much more seaworthy than her predecessors. Her complement of aircraft was 63. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was the most potent and visible symbol of Japanese prowess in the Pacific War. Purpose-designed as a Navy fighter to operate from land bases and aircraft carriers, the Zero would acquire an awesome reputation. The Zero had a remarkably clean airframe and was very light in weight. The result was high speed and excellent fuel economy. However, these advantages were achieved at the expense of pilot protection. The Zero had no armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. More Zeros would be built than any other Japanese aircraft. The Aichi D-3A Val 2-seater was the first all-metal monoplane dive bomber to enter Japanese naval service. In the hands of experts, the Val was a formidable weapon, realizing an 80% strike accuracy during the early Japanese conquests. The aircraft was constructed with such robustness and maneuverability that even with the fixed undercarriage, it could transform into a highly proficient fighter once it had released its bombs. Although the Nakajima B-5N Kate was slow and poorly protected, it was at the time of Midway the best aircraft of its type in the world. On its introduction in 1937, it had boasted many advanced features such as folding wings, a retractable undercarriage, and integral wing fuel tanks. Effective as a conventional bomber, as a torpedo bomber, the Kate was devastating. The aircraft was armed with the excellent Type 91 torpedo. The Type 91 could be released at a speed of 200 miles an hour and from an altitude of up to 300 meters, providing valuable protection against anti-aircraft fire. The naval pilots preparing for New Guinea and Midway operations were seasoned veterans of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had gone to fly on combat missions in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. For Japanese pilots, the intervals between combat operations were entirely taken up by training. The motto was, train hard, fight easy. Japanese determination to achieve the highest standards in Navy flying had not come without a price. Pilot training was lengthy and expensive. Only 100 naval pilots graduated annually from the training schools, which proved insufficient to meet the continuous demands imposed on Japanese carrier forces since the war began. There had been no leave for Navy aircrew. The training of Japanese sailors and flight deck personnel was, if anything, even more arduous than that undergone by their pilot comrades. These men were conscripts, toughened by rigorous discipline and relentless battle training that ensured that a ship could be swiftly prepared for action stations, and a full strike force could be launched within 5 minutes. During the heat of battle, a flight could be rearmed, refueled, and airborne again within 1 hour. Although the combat readiness of Japanese sailors and airmen was unsurpassed, there was an underlying weakness in the Navy's preparation for the coming operations. Before Pearl Harbor, aircrew had been able to practice 4 bomb runs a day, and dive bombers had been expected to score 80% hit rates or better. There had also been extensive fleet maneuvers. Now, amidst the exacerbated fuel shortages that ignited the war, maneuvers and bombing practice faced even stricter limitations. At Midway, the consequences for the Imperial Navy would be nothing short of catastrophic. Soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it had become clear to senior American naval commanders that although the damage done was severe, it was far from the fatal blow the Japanese had intended. The Pacific Fleet's priceless aircraft carriers had escaped. The Japanese had been unsuccessful in their attempts to obliterate the ship repair yards, and they had overlooked the fuel depots at the bases, leaving substantial oil reserves untouched. In spite of Japanese efforts, Pearl Harbor still played host to a powerful American naval presence. Hawaii was the base for the United States' 3 Pacific Fleet carriers, plus 1/4 transferred from the Atlantic Fleet. Each carrier was supported by its screen of up to 2 heavy cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nearly 20 submarines protected the waters around Oahu and Midway Island. Due to Admiral Nimitz's conviction that the Japanese Navy's overwhelming superiority made it one-hit-run tactics feasible, the sluggish Pacific Fleet battleships were excluded from any role in the forthcoming operation. Those that had been repaired after the Pearl Harbor attack were sent to San Francisco to patrol the west coast of the United States. Everything would now depend on the speed and long-range hitting power of the American carriers. All 3 of the carriers that would take part in the Battle of Midway were the Yorktown class. Commissioned by October 1941, the ships were Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise. Although slightly slower than its Japanese equivalent, the Yorktown class was capable of carrying an extra 20 aircraft. Yorktown carriers were notable for their advanced damage control systems. In order to reduce the risk of firing during an impending enemy attack, aviation gas fuel lines could be filled with carbon dioxide. The carrier's decks were also specially designed for combat conditions. The flight deck was unarmored and constructed with 6-inch planks of teak, more easily repaired than metal and less likely to cause severe splinter wounds to crewmen. Unlike the Japanese carriers, the Yorktowns were all equipped with radar, which could detect aircraft flying up to 30,000 feet and at a range of over 100 miles. While the Lexington would not participate in the Battle of Midway, it would assume a crucial role in the earlier engagement, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Lexington had been laid down as a battlecruiser in 1921 and converted during construction. She emerged as America's first fleet carrier and one of the largest aircraft carriers in the world. Because Lexington was a very early design, her available deck and hangar space was not efficiently used, and her aircraft complement was a modest 63. Originally conceived as a biplane carrier fighter, the Grumman Wildcat was redesigned as a mid-wing monoplane during the planning stages. The aircraft entered U.S. Navy service in 1939 and was manufactured first by Grumman and later by General Motors. Powered by a Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engine, the Wildcat was slower than its opposite number, the Zero. Nonetheless, its exceptional maneuverability, formidable 6-gun armament, effective armor, and robust construction meant that the Wildcats could frequently endure battle damage that would be catastrophic for any other fighter. Nearly 8,000 Wildcats would see service in World War II. From its introduction in June 1940, the Douglas Dauntless was one of the most important American combat aircraft of the war. In the first half of 1942, the Dauntless saw more action than any other type. The Dauntless was a dive bomber with heavy armor, a bulletproof windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was powered by a 9-cylinder Wright Cyclone radial engine. Because of its great stability in flight, the aircraft was known affectionately to its pilots as the Barge. When it first entered service with the U.S. Navy, the Dauntless was the best carrier-based dive bomber in the world. The aircraft would take credit for sinking more Japanese shipping than any other Allied weapon, and during the Battle of Midway, it would be responsible for all Japanese ship losses. The 3-man Douglas Devastator, America's first carrier monoplane, had entered service in 1937, and by 1942 was already obsolete. It was slow, lightly armed, and had a poor rate of climb. At Midway, Devastators would suffer appalling losses, and the battle would be the aircraft's last major action of the war. The Grumman TBF was initially conceived as a replacement for the Devastator, and despite its rapid design process, it would ultimately establish itself as the most successful torpedo bomber of World War II. The TBF was a robust and powerful 3-seater aircraft. It was the first American naval warplane to mount a power-operated turret, and the only to carry its torpedo internally. The TBF entered service in early 1942, but only 6 were available for the Battle of Midway. All were stationed on Midway Island. It would be the TBF's first combat action, and in the memory of the men lost during the battle, the aircraft would afterwards be renamed the Avenger. The consolidated PBY Catalina would become one of the most successful flying boats of World War II, and the most numerous flying boat ever. The Catalina was unique as the first flying boat to feature cantilever wings which needed no supporting spars. It also had established floats, which could be retracted to form the wingtips in flight. The resulting aerodynamic efficiency made for speed and long range. After the first 4 marks of the PBY flying boat, the aircraft was fitted with retractable tricycle landing gear to give it an amphibious capability. While capable of carrying a substantial bomb load, it was the long-range reconnaissance capability of the Catalina that proved to be invaluable to the Americans during the Battle of Midway. Catalinas would also save the lives of many ditched American flyers. The B-17, a 4-engine heavy bomber, had first entered service with the United States Army in June 1939. Despite the aircraft's later fame as a strategic bomber, its original specification was actually for a long-range anti-shipping weapon, a role it would indeed fulfill during the Battle of Midway, driven by political considerations. The B-17E fully lived up to its designation as a flying fortress, intended to operate in self-defending formations. The B-17E mounted 2 hydraulically operated turrets, one of them a retractable ball underneath the aircraft. Altogether, the fortress carried 11 machine guns and was fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks and extensive armor. Despite its size and power, the B-17 had a low wing loading, making it more likely to return its crew home even when sustaining heavy combat damage compared to other aircraft of its class. In the Battle of Midway, 19 B-17s of the U.S. Army Air Force would operate against the Japanese. To extend their range, they would carry extra fuel tanks and half their normal bomb load. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had united the American people at a single stroke. Military and civilians alike shared a bitter resolve to see the Japanese totally defeated. Across the country, hundreds of thousands flocked to the recruitment centers. The impact of the Japanese attack had been particularly deep felt by the personnel of the United States Navy, and this humiliation had infused even the most routine training exercises with extraordinary level of intensity.
Unlike the Japanese, whose trainee naval pilots were an elite selected at 14 years of age, the Americans recruited from a much wider segment of the population.
In the United States, there were far more suitably educated recruits with the right mental and physical qualities for a carrier pilot. On America's entry into the war, the training schools were easily expanded without any appreciable fall-off in quality.
After 3 months of elementary flying instruction, the aspiring naval pilots spent another 3 months in basic Navy training.
Periods at 2 more flight schools were followed, and only the best were selected for training as carrier pilots. Despite the high quality of U.S. Navy flight training, American carrier pilots would enter combat with significantly less flight experience, having amassed just over half the 700 hours of flying time achieved by their Japanese counterparts. They had also, as yet, seen little combat. Some of them had participated in raids on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, primarily organized for training and morale-boosting purposes rather than significant strategic objectives. These actions, however, were relatively minor and encountered minimal serious opposition. As for the flight deck crew, American performance was at least as effective as the Japanese. The men were just as capable of launching a wave of strike aircraft within 5 minutes. Where the Americans did have a real edge on the enemy was in damage control. Damage control parties were highly trained in their duties, and their ability to deal with fire, the greatest threat to any warship, was unsurpassed. During the Battle of Midway, the comparative damage control abilities of each side would emerge as a crucial determinant in shaping the battle's outcome. By late April 1942, preparations for the Japanese campaign were well underway. Naval facilities at the port of Rabaul had been greatly expanded, and thousands of troops had been assembled, ready for the conquest of New Guinea and Tulagi. The troops' transports were ready to sail, along with the escorts of cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese anticipated little opposition on Tulagi, and once the island had been captured, the Port Moresby assault would follow. In both cases, the Japanese expected that surprise would be on their side.
As the 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, which had gathered for their mission, readied themselves to carry out their jobs, one to escort the Port Moresby invasion force, and the other 2 to assume positions in the Coral Sea,
the Americans acted decisively. A task force based around the carriers Yorktown and Lexington was sent racing to intercept the Japanese. On May the 1st, south of the Solomon Islands, the carriers rendezvoused with a powerful force of Australian cruisers. The stage was now set for the Battle of the Coral Sea, marking the initial engagement in an epic confrontation that would ultimately alter the course of the Pacific War. The capture of the island of Tulagi on May the 3rd, 1942 was, as the Japanese expected, simply a matter of dropping anchor and disembarking the troops. Tulagi's tiny garrison of Australians had already been evacuated. The first blow in Japan's great campaign of expansion had apparently gone strictly to plan. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the American carrier Yorktown with Admiral Fletcher aboard had received intelligence regarding the deployments in Tulagi and was already underway, heading north. At 7 a.m. on the morning after the Tulagi landings, Yorktown struck. 40 of Fletcher's aircraft were launched against the Japanese fleet and the occupation force. In little over an hour, the American bombers and torpedo bombers had sunk or damaged the destroyer, 3 minesweepers, a number of landing craft, and several seaplanes.
For the Japanese, it was the first unsettling evidence that American carriers lurked in the area.
On already the second day of operations, events were already taking an ominous turn. By the following day, Yorktown and her escorts had already to rendezvous with Lexington. The 2 escort groups now merged to form a single screen around the carriers. They had joined forces only just in time. The Japanese carriers Chokaku and Zuikaku had entered the Coral Sea, and the 2 fleets were now just 70 miles apart. On the morning of May the 7th, the American carrier task force with Lexington and Yorktown was cruising on a northwesterly course.
The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were sailing on parallel course.
Each fleet was unaware of the other's presence. American scout planes sent to the northeast failed to find the Japanese carriers, but as soon as they heard, the Americans launched a strike force of 93 aircraft. In fact, the ships sided with the cruisers and destroyers of the New Guinea invasion force, but soon after, the Shoho was spotted only 25 miles away, and the attack was redirected. Shoho was hit by 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes. She sank within minutes. For the Imperial Navy, the loss of Shoho was deeply traumatic.
So shocked were the Japanese commanders that the invasion of Port Moresby was immediately cancelled and the troop ships returned back to Rabaul.
On the American side, there was jubilation. A pilot's radio report of the Shoho sinking, Scratch 1 flat top, would become one of the most famous signals of the Pacific War. After the sinking of the Shoho, Admiral Fletcher did not immediately launch another strike against the Japanese invasion fleet.
To attack the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku was his main objective, and in any case, the Japanese might themselves attack, and he would need his air defense at full strength.
As the day advanced, a weather front closed in on the Japanese carriers. Nevertheless, the strike force commander, Admiral Tagaki, was determined to destroy the Americans before they could inflict yet more damage on the retreating Japanese invasion fleet. Choosing his best night flyers, Tagaki launched his attack in the late afternoon. The aircraft would have to return and land in darkness. The Japanese raiders, in spite of the poor weather, passed close to the American carrier group. The Americans, with the benefit of radar, easily detected the enemy formations and vectored their fighters to intercept. In a series of vicious dogfights, 10 Japanese aircraft were shot down. 11 more would crash after the mission, trying to land in darkness. For the Japanese, the raid was a fiasco. In the aftermath of this first carrier clash between the Imperial Navy and the U.S. Pacific Fleet, both sides considered attacking by night with their cruisers and destroyers. Both finally rejected the idea, fearing the absence of their protective screens. Instead, they withdrew, postponing the main action for another day. On the morning of May the 8th, the American and Japanese fleets were more than 100 miles apart. The Japanese had the benefit of low cloud cover, while the Americans were exposed under the clear blue skies. At 0600, both sides launched their reconnaissance aircraft, and within 2 hours, each fleet had discovered the other. On the American side, Yorktown and Lexington launched 70 bombers and torpedo bombers and 6 fighters.
At almost the same time, Shokaku and Zuikaku launched 50 attack aircraft and 20 fighters. Although the Japanese carriers were close together, Zuikaku was hidden by a cloud, and it was Shokaku who fell victim to the Americans.
She was hit by 3 bombs and so badly damaged that she would later be unable to recover her aircraft. Most would be forced to ditch into the sea. The American carriers, using their radar, detected the approaching Japanese raiders 70 miles away. 12 Wildcat fighters were scrambled, but only 3 reached a high enough altitude to attack, and no Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Yorktown was first to be hit. A single bomb found its target. The next victim was the larger and less maneuverable Lexington, 2 bombs struck her deck, inflicting minor damage. But far more seriously, 2 torpedoes impacted her port side. Even after the Japanese bombs and torpedoes had struck, Lexington continued to fight. But soon after the battle, she began to list to port. By pumping oil from one side of the carrier to the other, the crew managed to right the vessel, and she was soon capable of maintaining 24 knots. It looked as if Lexington might be able to reach home under her own steam. However, at 14:45, an explosion ripped through the carrier, and soon fires were raging out of control. The order was given to abandon ship, and after her crew had been taken off, a destroyer was detailed to sink the hell-blazing hulk with torpedoes. 38 aircraft were still on board. The destruction of Lexington meant that the Battle of the Coral Sea was a tactical victory for the Japanese. The light carrier Shoho had been exchanged for the far more formidable Lexington. However, the Imperial Navy had been far more badly damaged than it seemed.
The carrier Shokaku was out of action, and Zuikaku's aircrew had been slaughtered.
As a result, neither carrier would be able to participate in the decisive battle soon to be fought at Midway. In the aftermath of the Coral Sea battle, the Japanese made a fatal error. They knew they had sunk the Lexington, but they also believed that Yorktown had been smashed beyond repair.
Even with 2 of their own heavy carriers out of action and the loss of the Shoho, they were certain that the balance was still in their favor.
The remaining Japanese carriers, supported by battleships and heavy cruisers, would still have more than enough firepower to send the American Pacific Fleet to the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese main force for the Battle of Midway was based in Hashirajima in Japan. The main force was commanded by Admiral Yamamoto himself. Yamamoto had 7 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 2 seaplane carriers, 1 light carrier, and 20 destroyers. Attached to the main force was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force, the most powerful carrier fleet at that time in the world. His heavy cruisers, Hiryu, Soryu, Akagi, and Kaga, would be escorted by 2 fast battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Midway Invasion Force was commanded by Admiral Nobukate Kondo. Its main body was made up of 2 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light carrier, and 7 destroyers. Subordinate to Admiral Kondo was the Midway Occupation Force commanded by Rear Admiral Reisa Tanaka. Tanaka had 12 transports with 5,000 troops and a screen of 1 light cruiser, 10 destroyers, and 3 patrol boats. At the Guams and the Marianas was the Midway Support Force under the command of Rear Admiral Taeko Kurita. Kurita had 4 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. As well as his Midway forces, Admiral Yamamoto had an overall command of the Aleutians fleet. Based in the anchorage of Ominato in the northern island of the Japanese homeland. The northern force was made up of a carrier striking force with 1 heavy and 1 light carrier, 2 cruisers, and 3 destroyers. There was also an invasion fleet of 4 transports carrying 1,000 soldiers, accompanied by a 7-strong destroyer screen. With the Lexington sunk and the Yorktown badly damaged in the Coral Sea, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been critically weakened. Yorktown went to the dry dock in Pearl Harbor with damage estimated to need at least 3 months to repair. In fact, the yards achieved near miraculous results. The job was done in 3 days, with 1,500 men working around the clock. How much minor damage had not yet been put right, and as the carrier sailed, scores of dockyard crew remained on board. Admiral Chester Nimitz, overall commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, would stay in Pearl Harbor throughout the Battle of Midway. Communicating with his ships by radio, Nimitz divided his carriers into 2 task forces. Task Force 17 was commanded by Admiral Frank Fletcher, veteran of the Coral Sea.
Fletcher had Yorktown as his flagship, 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers.
Fletcher also had operational command of Task Force 16, led by Admiral Raymond Spruance.
Spruans had the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, along with 2 cruisers and 11 destroyers. From Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz deployed 19 submarines for reconnaissance and attack, which would patrol off Midway and Hawaii. He would also call on aircraft based on the island of Midway itself. The U.S. Army Air Force had 4 B-26s and 19 B-17E bombers. The Marines fielded 20 Buffalo and 7 Wildcat fighters. They also had 11 Vindicator and 16 Dauntless bombers. The Navy had 38 Catalinas and 6 TBF torpedo bombers. The island was also defended by the 6th Marine Defense Battalion of 3,000 men. On the morning of May the 27th, the Japanese carrier strike force under Admiral Nagumo sailed from Hashirajima. By nightfall, they had entered the Pacific and were heading for Midway. The following day, the Aleutians invasion force and the main body of warships sorted from Ominato. At the same time, far to the south, the Midway invasion force, with its escort of destroyers and invasion support force of heavy cruisers, sorted from the Marianas. Last to leave port, on the 29th, were the invasion force main body and Yamamoto's fleet, each of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Although Admiral Nimitz and his senior commanders knew that Midway was to be invaded, for security reasons, no one on the island was told that the mightiest concentration of naval power in history was bearing down upon them. Piecemeal, Midway's marine garrison was reinforced and the island's anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened. Every day, the Catalina flying boats patrol the ocean around the island in greater numbers. Although none of their crew knew yet precisely what they were searching for. The Japanese, too, had begun their reconnaissance effort. An advanced submarine force had been at sea for many days, racing towards Hawaii. Its task would be to set up a picket north of Pearl Harbor and report the strength of any American fleet dispatched to Midway. The submarines were in fact already too late. On May the 28th, Task Force 16 left Pearl Harbor unobserved, followed by Task Force 17 on the 30th. Both groups vanished into the Pacific Ocean, and the Japanese submarines, which would finally arrive on June 3rd, would watch in vain. By June the 2nd, the Japanese Northern Force was plowing its way through the Northern Pacific, towards the Aleutians. The island, although of immense strategic importance to the United States, were sparsely manned, the only forces of any consequence deployed at Dutch Harbor. The Americans, expecting the Japanese attack, flew repeated reconnaissance missions, but because of poor weather, failed to locate the enemy. The Japanese at first feared little better, but a second strike group did succeed in bombing Dutch Harbor. Over the following days, troops from the Special Naval Landing Force occupied Kiska and Attu. Although the Aleutians operation was in tactical terms a complete success, and the Japanese occupation of the islands would be a thorn in the American side for some time to come, the primary objective of the invasion had failed. The Americans, instead of dispatching strong naval forces north away from Midway, ignored the diversion. A key element in the Japanese plan failed completely. While the Japanese Northern Force was launching its attack on the Aleutians, hundreds of miles to the south, Nagumo's carrier strike force was fast approaching Midway. 200 miles behind Will Yamamoto's main force battleships and steaming from the southwest, the Midway invasion fleet. With no cloud cover, the invasion flotilla was desperately exposed, and by now, Midway's Catalinas were sweeping a huge arc of ocean, up to 700 miles, covering all the likely approaches to the island. It was on June 3rd, at 0900 hours, that a Catalina made the first sighting of Japanese ships off Midway. The pilot reported 2 cargo vessels. 21 minutes later, another Catalina, flown by Ensign Jack Reed, and just beyond the extreme limit of its allotted search, spotted a large formation of ships. The message dispatched to Midway read, "Sighted main body," and a few minutes later gave its bearing and range.
Although the distance, 700 miles, was within the capabilities of Midway's B-17 bombers, which already had their extra fuel tanks fitted and were armed and waiting, Midway's commanders were unwilling to commit their forces without more information. It would be another 2 hours of steadily mounting tension before a radio message confirmed the sighting of a large body of Japanese warships. Meanwhile, reports of the sighting were passed on to the American carriers. The two American carrier task forces were waiting 325 miles to the northeast of Midway. The Catalina's report placed the Japanese main body to the southwest. However, Nimitz was confident of his intelligence sources and certain that the ships were only the Japanese invasion force. Nimitz signaled his commanders, "The carrier strike force will hit from the northwest, tomorrow." Fletcher ordered the Enterprise and Hornet to change course, and both task forces headed south to lie in wait. With the sighting of the Japanese invasion fleet confirmed, Midway's B-17s were finally given the order to attack. At 12:25 hours, 9 bombers lumbered down the island's runway to launch the first attack of the Battle of Midway. It would take over 4 hours for the B-17s to reach the enemy fleet and begin their high-level runs. Because of their extra fuel tanks, the fortresses were carrying only 36 500-pound bombs between them. None struck home. From altitude, the effects were hard to judge, and the crews reported hits on 6 vessels, including 2 battleships. In the aftermath, the U.S. Army Air Force would claim a major victory for land-based high-level bombers. Throughout the night of June the 3rd, the atmosphere on Midway was tense, but confident. The reports of B-17 crews were encouraging. Everyone believed that at least some damage had been done to the Japanese fleet. During the night, a Catalina torpedo attack on the invasion transports did succeed in hitting 1 Japanese oiler. Insignificant in real terms, but heartening for the waiting Marines. At first light, Midway's Catalinas were once more dispatched on their reconnaissance patrols. Because a Japanese raid on the airfield was almost certain, the B-17s were ordered to take off once more to prevent them from being caught on the ground. As the Japanese carrier strike force steamed at 24 knots on its final run into Midway, sailors and air crew prepared themselves for the ordeal ahead with traditional toasts and worship at the Shinto shrine on board every Japanese warship. All were keenly aware that they were about to strike the first major blow in a battle on which depended not only on their own lives, but the future of the Japanese Empire. At 0430 hours, Admiral Nagumo turned his carriers into the wind and launched his first strike wave, 108 aircraft in all. The rest, including his most experienced aircrew, were held in reserve in case any American warships were discovered. Nagumo believed the possibility extremely remote, so only after his first wave had been sent to Midway did he order the reconnaissance aircraft to begin their search on the surrounding ocean. The search, mounted by the Japanese carrier strike force, was conducted by only 7 aircraft from 5 ships. Akagi and Kaga each launched 1 VAL at 0430 hours. Both aircraft were to search 300 miles out and could cover an area 60 miles wide. At the same time, the battleship Haruna launched 1 float plane with a range of 150 miles. The cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, were each dispatched 2 float planes. But technical problems delayed Tone's aircraft for up to half an hour, and one of Chikuma's developed engine trouble and would have to turn back. The search was dangerously incomplete. As the Japanese scouted for American carriers, the Catalinas were in their turn looking for the Japanese. At 0530 hours, a single enemy carrier was sighted. On Midway Island and on the ships of the American task forces, the effect was electrifying. The Japanese were exactly where Admiral Nimitz had expected them to be. Shortly after the first sighting, one more vital piece of information was received from the Catalinas. A wave of strike aircraft was approaching the island. To Admiral Spruance on board the Enterprise, it was a priceless piece of information. Soon after the aircraft had hit Midway, the Japanese carriers would have to retrieve them for rearming and refueling. At that point, the carriers would be supremely vulnerable. As the Japanese strike wave came within range of Midway radar, all the island's remaining aircraft were scrambled. When the enemy arrived, the runways and hangars would be clear. Midway's fighters would be waiting to meet them, and the island's force of bombers and torpedo bombers would already be on their way to strike back at the Japanese carriers. In spite of the valiant efforts of Midway's mostly obsolete fighters, the Japanese bombers and dive bombers broke through without having lost a single aircraft. However, as soon as the lead attackers came within range of the island's anti-aircraft guns, they were met by a hail of fire. Finding no American planes on the ground, the bombers attacked and destroyed Midway's oil tanks on Sand Island. At the same time, the dive bombers targeted the airfield and hangars on Eastern Island and destroyed virtually every building in sight. With 15 of Midway's defending fighters already shot down, the Japanese fighters were now free to strafe ground targets. They too met a murderous hail of anti-aircraft fire. In all, 6 Japanese aircraft would fall to Midway's guns. When the Japanese headed back to their carriers at 0643, it was already apparent to the strike leader that although they left behind a trail of destruction, they had not succeeded in their primary objective. By radio, he reported that most of Midway's aircraft had escaped, and the island's runways remained largely intact. Midway's bombers were still a serious threat to the Japanese fleet. Even before the strike wave had returned to its carriers, Admiral Nagumo was ordering a second attack on the island. Only moments later, there was a dramatic confirmation of the threat Midway's aircraft posed to Nagumo's carriers. 6 American TBF torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 medium bombers suddenly bore down on the Japanese carrier fleet. The screening destroyers and cruisers put up a storm of anti-aircraft fire. At the same time, 10 Zero fighters of Akagi's Combat Air Patrol swooped in to attack. The TBFs did succeed in launching at Akagi, but violent maneuvering saved the Japanese carrier. Savaged by the Zeros and by furious anti-aircraft fire, only 1 TBF and 2 B-26s survived the raid. At almost the same time as the Japanese fleet was beating off the first wave of attackers from Midway, the American task forces were preparing to launch their own strike waves. Reconnaissance had now confirmed that there were not 1, but 2 enemy carriers in the area. Such a target was simply too good a chance to miss. The latest reconnaissance placed the 2 Japanese carriers over 200 miles from the Americans. The maximum range for an airstrike was around 150 miles, so the first priority was to close the gap. Assuming that Nagumo's carriers would still be steaming towards Midway, Fletcher set a course to intercept. Only Sperance's Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet was to be sent. Task Force 17 with Yorktown would wait to recover her scout planes and follow later. If the Americans were to catch the Japanese as they rearmed aircraft returning from the attack on Midway, they would have to launch their first strike wave around 0700 hours. Although the range was closing quickly, it was still too great for the devastated torpedo bombers to strike and return home. They would be sent regardless. Those that survived the raid would have to ditch in the sea. Altogether, Hornet and Enterprise launched 29 Devastator torpedo bombers and 72 Dauntless dive bombers. For fighter, they were covered by 20 Wildcats. Admiral Spruance was aware that only 2 of at least 4 Japanese carriers had been located, and kept 36 fighters to defend his task force from any Japanese counterattack. As the strike groups from the Hornet and Enterprise set course for the enemy fleet, Yorktown, her scout planes now recovered, raced to catch up with Task Force 16. At 0838, Admiral Fletcher launched his strike aircraft. Within half an hour, the total number of American aircraft heading for the Japanese fleet had reached 156. Even now, the Japanese were still unaware that they had been found and targeted by enemy carriers. Nagumo's men were toiling to prepare their aircraft for the second raid on Midway, and the Admiral was confident his fleet was secure. His scout planes had been out almost 2 hours and had reported no sign of an American task force. In fact, Japanese reconnaissance had been a disastrous failure. By now, Task Force 16, streaming towards Nagumo's fleet, was well inside the search area of the Japanese scout planes. However, Chikuma's float plane had flown right past the Americans and had failed to spot them, because Tone's scout could not search the same area until the return leg of its flight, and had been delayed by half an hour to begin with. The error was not detected for a considerable time. When it was 0725, the pilot's report mentioned only enemy surface ships. As a result, Nagumo now believed there was no immediate threat from the American carriers. At 0748, as the Japanese were just about to launch the second Midway strike, they themselves suddenly came under attack. It was another raid from Midway Island. First came 16 dauntless dive bombers, whose inexperienced pilots approached in a shallow glide. The Zeros of Nagumo's combat air patrol destroyed half their number before they even reached the carriers. Next came Midway's B-17s, dropping their bombs from 20,000 feet. Not a single Japanese vessel was hit. Midway's Marine Vindicators were equally unsuccessful. As the American raiders headed home and Nagumo once more turned into the wind to launch his second wave against Midway, dramatic news was reported by a scout plane. The pilot had spotted a carrier. For Nagumo, the revelation could not have come at a worse moment. While the Japanese second wave was preparing to launch, Nagumo's first wave just returned from Midway was cycling, waiting to land, also waiting to refuel and rearmed with the fleet's Zero fighters, which had been in action protecting the carriers. If Nagumo were to launch his second wave against the reported enemy carrier, they would have to go without fighter cover. Nagumo decided to wait. He would return his second wave below decks, recovering his circling aircraft for refueling, then launch a full-scale attack on the American fleet. At 0917, with all their aircraft recovered, the Japanese carriers, up to now heading towards Midway, turned east-northeast to close with the American force. Nagumo's strike force would be ready to launch at 10:30 hours. As the Japanese surged ahead at 30 knots, the decks of Nagumo's carriers were chaotic. Flight crews struggled frantically to refuel and rearm their aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes lay everywhere, and there was no time to follow safety procedures. And unknown to the Japanese, who had no radar, the first American torpedo bombers were only 3 minutes away. The American air group from Task Force 16 that followed a course based on the assumption that the Japanese fleet had carried on sailing towards Midway. Instead, Nagumo had changed course. As a result, most of the dive bombers and fighters from Hornet, 45 aircraft in all, failed to find the enemy. A second group of Hornet's aircraft had also at first missed Nagumo's fleet, but had then turned north and within minutes had found the Japanese carriers. The first target for Hornet's torpedo bombers was Akagi. As the squadron swept in at low level, the Zeros pounced. The few Americans that survived were torn apart by the fleet's anti-aircraft fire. Not one torpedo bomber and only one pilot survived. Within minutes of the first raid, torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown began their attack. Once again, the American pilots were slaughtered and no enemy ships were hit. Only 6 raiders survived. With the torpedo attacks beaten off and his fleet still fully unscathed, Nagumo was at last ready to send his waiting strike aircraft against the American carriers. Just as the launch signal was about to be given, American dive bombers, which had been lurking high in the clouds, pounced on the carriers. The first victim was Kaga. The time was around 10:20 hours. The first bomb to strike Kaga landed on the rear of her flight deck, squarely amongst aircraft, armed and waiting to take off. 2 more hit near her forward elevator. Another exploded in the hangar below, igniting fuel and detonating bombs. Kaga was left a raging inferno within minutes, and almost everyone on her bridge was killed. As Kaga burned, Akagi was launching its first Zero fighter for the attack that was supposed to smash the American fleet. At that moment, 3 Dauntless dive bombers struck. The first hit on Akagi landed near her midships lift and exploded in the hangar. The next fell amongst the parked aircraft on her deck. Fuel and bombs ignited immediately, killing the elite of the Japanese air fleet in their cockpits. Within minutes, the fire had spread forward, and Admiral Nagumo's flagship was doomed. The next victim of the American dive bombers was Soryu. Just after 10:25, 3 bombs smashed into the carrier's flight deck. The first bomb fell between Soryu's second and third lifts. The next landed in front of the forward lift and penetrated to the hangar, detonating bombs, torpedoes, and fuel. The third struck on the rear deck, completely destroying a waiting strike wave. In the space of 5 minutes, the mightiest carrier fleet in existence had been shattered. Admiral Nagumo, his flagship blazing, was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Of his once magnificent carrier force, only Hiryu was left, and immediately the order was given to launch her strike aircraft. There was still some hope, but even now, a devastating blow could be visited on the American enemy. The first wave of Hiryu's strike force was made up of 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. The target was Task Force 17 and the carrier Yorktown. Shortly before noon, the Vals were detected by Yorktown's radar. Already, 12 Wildcat fighters were in the air covering the carrier, and another 15 were on the deck refueling. These were ordered to launch at once. At the same time, Yorktown's aviation gas lines were shut down and her fire suppression system was activated. The Japanese strike wave, approaching at 10,000 feet, ran straight into Yorktown's fighter defenses. 10 were shot down by the Wildcats. The 14 survivors headed straight for the American carrier. 5 Vals survived the gauntlet of Wildcats and the hail of fire put up by Yorktown and her escorts. 3 bombs plunged into Fletcher's flagship. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck and exploded. The second penetrated and burst below the funnel, damaging all but one of the ship's boilers and destroying her radar room. The third bomb crashed through Yorktown's #1 elevator and deep into her hangar. In spite of being hit by 3 bombs, so good was Yorktown's damage control that potentially catastrophic fires were quickly put out. No fuel or magazines exploded, and amazingly, Yorktown was streaming at 20 knots and able to recover and relaunch her fighters within 1 hour and 40 minutes of the attack. By now, the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu had launched her second wave. A scratch force of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters. Once again, American Wildcats savaged the raiders, but 9 torpedo bombers survived and swept into the attack. Because Yorktown was no longer belching smoke, she was mistaken for one of the unscathed sister ships. Although 5 more Kates were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, 4 launched their torpedoes. Yorktown was hit twice on the port side, and one of the raiders deliberately crashed onto her deck. Within seconds of the strike, Yorktown was racked by explosions and began to list to port. At 1500 hours, the order was given to abandon ship. As the first of Yorktown's crew were being taken off by her attendant destroyers, aboard Enterprise, Admiral Spruance received news from a scout aircraft that Hiryu had been spotted. The Japanese carrier was 100 miles northwest of the dying Yorktown. At 1530 hours, Enterprise launched 24 Dauntless dive bombers and Hornet another 16. Meanwhile, Hiryu was recovering and refueling her last remaining aircraft for a third strike against the American carriers. At 17:05, the Dauntless, undetected by Hiryu's combat air patrol, screamed down out of the sun. Hiryu maneuvered violently, but 4 bombs found their target. The first two bombs to hit blew Hiryu's #1 lift clean off, and left the whole forward deck a massive flame. The other two penetrated to the hangar, where bombs and fuel exploded violently. The waiting aircraft at the rear of the flight deck blew up, killing almost all their pilots. Admiral Nagumo's last carrier was finished, and with her, Japanese domination of the skies over the Pacific. When Admiral Yamamoto learned of the catastrophe that had befallen his fleet, he did not at once abandon all hope. Perhaps with the awesome firepower of his battleships and cruisers, he could yet destroy the Americans in a night battle. Yamamoto was clutching at straws. That evening, American carriers sailed eastward, and Yamamoto could no longer force a battle before daylight exposed his ships to air attack. At 02:55 on the morning of June the 5th, Admiral Yamamoto ordered a general withdrawal. On the morning of June the 6th, strike waves from the Enterprise and Hornet added to the American tally of 4 Japanese carriers by sinking one cruiser and damaging another. With them, the number of Japanese dead rose to 3,500 men. On the American side, the cost of victory was the carrier Yorktown, finally sunk by torpedoes from a prowling Japanese submarine, and the destroyer Hammond that had been lying alongside. In all, 307 aircrew, sailors, and Marines had died. For the United States, the Battle of Midway would prove the turning point in the fight against Japan. Unable to replace her losses in carriers and aircrew, the Japanese Empire would never again be capable of taking the initiative. Japan had not only suffered the greatest defeat in her history, but had, in a single day, lost the Pacific War.
Japan launches its own counteroffensive in the Pacific. Theirs is unlike anything America has seen before. Japanese aircraft head straight towards U.S. destroyers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, flown by men prepared to sacrifice their own lives. It is known as Kamikaze, where pilots turn their planes into missiles. Suicide missions intended to cripple the American war machine as they inch closer towards the heart of Japan. These pilots follow the rule of divine wind. Loyal to the Emperor and their homeland, they are willing to die for both. Their weapons are their bodies. Their targets are American ships, pilots, and sailors. This is a story from 2 different perspectives. From the men willing to die for their country, and from the men determined to stop them. By 1944, the Empire of Japan is in a state of retreat. The area in which they hope to create a Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is now a distant memory. The spirit of late 1941, when the land of the rising sun seemed invincible, has vanished. Since America's victory at Midway, the United States takes back island after island from Hirohito's forces. Japanese fighter aircraft are outnumbered by more modern American planes, being produced from the factories in droves. Experienced Japanese pilots are in short supply. In addition, the proximity fuse is utilized, making it almost impossible for Japanese bombers to get anywhere near U.S. naval vessels. No longer do they control the Pacific with an iron fist. By January of 1944, even those in the top circles of Japanese power have concluded that the war is lost. For a nation dependent on imports, they are denied the raw materials desperately needed to continue the war. Japanese merchant ships carrying oil, coal, and other goods are either attacked from the sky or torpedoed by American submarines. Production in Japan is slashed to shreds. To make matters worse, a naval blockade is causing severe shortages in food and materials, resulting in mass starvation. On paper, the war is all but won by the United States.
Really, by the fall of 1944, it's clear from Hirohito's recent biographers who've really studied the Japanese documents, by the fall of 44, he knew Japan had lost the war. But surrender was not on the table because of this notion of honor, and he was also really obsessed with protecting the sort of royal regalia, the symbols of the emperor's authority. And, you know, all through the summer of 45, the Japanese press was running what Hirohito's biographer Herbert Bix called the Die for the Emperor campaign. I mean, this was the message to the whole society.
As the American invasion forces got closer and closer to the homeland, it became an even bigger and more purposeful strategy to not necessarily to win the war, but to make the cost of getting closer and closer to the Japanese homeland so great that they'd be able to achieve a negotiated peace.
For America, the road to Tokyo has been a bloody affair, with thousands of troops killed in the process. The Japanese proved themselves to be warriors, fighting until their last breath, based on a sacred samurai code known as Bushido. Surrender is not an option for its citizens, who are told that they will be shamed forever if they give in to the Americans.
The Army and Marines had certainly encountered this in some of the islands that were taken where Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner, and they were essentially told and ordered to, oh, you don't know what's going to happen to you, and it's part of this honor not to be taken prisoners. So there had been this sort of preview of the same mentality that American forces had encountered already.
United States generals realized that if the resistance on these islands is this fierce, the invasion of Japan itself could be the mother of all bloodbaths.
The rules of war were that you fought until your last breath, and that was expected of your enemy as well. So the concept of surrendering was something that the Japanese military did not recognize or respect. And it had big consequences on both sides during the conflict, that it was no quarter on both sides.
With the acquisition of island outposts by U.S. forces, landing strips are prepared for the arrival of the massive B-29 Superfortress. Being twice the size and having twice the range of the B-17, this gigantic bomber is what America hopes will be the deciding factor in the Pacific, having the capability of flying over Yokohama, Nagoya, and the capital city of Tokyo, allowing for a massive bombardment of the Japanese home islands.
Massed B-29 attacks, hundreds of bombers flying in close formation, dropping incendiaries, were extraordinarily effective in burning Japanese cities. There's no question about that. The attack in Tokyo, again, this is conventional bombs, incendiaries, burned square miles of the city, did huge amount of damage, probably caused 100,000 or so civilian deaths, rivaling what or possibly even exceeding what the atomic bombs did.
If the war can be won from the air, hopefully a D-Day style invasion in the Pacific can be avoided. Yet, despite all the deaths and starvation throughout Japan, its military still refuses to acquiesce to the demands of an unconditional surrender. By mid-1944, with American forces ready to take back the Philippines, it becomes clear that the people of Japan will not accept defeat without a fight to the death. Their loyalty is to Emperor Hirohito, and the idea of foreigners occupying the homeland is a concept completely alien to them. They would rather die than surrender to America. It is this belief system that allows the Kamikaze fighter to emerge.
A lot of people who've written about the kamikaze suggest that there's some origins in the Shinto religion and the samurai code, and I think that's undeniably true, but it's also stretching it. That there was this, certainly a Japanese martial tradition, there was this notion of personal loyalty to the emperor, and that was clearly driving it. Hirohito himself was very impressed and very supportive of the whole idea of these special attack forces and thought, well, this is the supreme expression of the devotion of the Japanese people to their emperor personally. That's how he viewed it.
In order to protect a perimeter of islands giving America the ability to bomb Japan, squadrons of volunteers begin enlisting for their own version of a divine wind against the United States.
A decision was made, and basically it was during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that the best chance they had of taking out an American fleet, an American invasion fleet, was to purposely crash their aircraft into these ships.
Unable to sink numerically superior aircraft carriers through traditional methods, they instead must resort to the doctrine of kamikaze.
If this had been the United States and the Japanese were advancing on our homeland and we had disadvantages in terms of resources, aircraft, and pilots, and wanted to fend off an advancing enemy, certainly, anything becomes possible.
Under the leadership of Admiral Onishi, thousands of men trained for what will be their last mission. A true believer in the Bushido Code, Onishi, with the Emperor's blessing, begins organizing a suicidal war plan. The Oka, a piloted rocket bomb, is authorized along with a human torpedo known as the Kai-10, as weapons to be used against American ships.
There were a small number of special purpose kamikaze aircraft built, the most famous of which was the so-called Cherry Blossom, which was basically a bomb with stubby wings and a cockpit welded on top and a solid rocket motor, and this was dropped from a bomber. The solid rocket motor would be used to accelerate this into a dive approaching 600 miles per hour, so that was particularly difficult to counter when you had such a high terminal speed.
These are in addition to the thousands of kamikaze pilots being trained for their final act in uniform. The goal is simple: fly straight into American ships, and hopefully, with the mixture of fire and gasoline, the explosion causes the vessel to sink.
One pilot and one plane can take out a ship that may have 300 sailors, 500, maybe as many as 3,000 sailors, with one well-placed hit. And in a number of occasions they did that or came close to doing it on many others.
And because the decks of American aircraft carriers are made of wood, the probability of a ship going down is even more likely. A key target then for the kamikaze pilots is the central deck elevator, believing that a successful attack can, at the very least, disable the carrier. The advantages of the kamikaze are numerous. Pilots need very little training. Obsolete aircraft can be used, and even if planes are hit by a proximity-fused shell, the momentum can hopefully keep the aircraft on target. The average kamikaze pilot is given a 1-week crash course in suicide attacks. 2 days are spent practicing takeoffs, another 2 to study formation flying, with the last 3 days spent on how to strike a target successfully.
It was a case where some very young pilots were kind of dragooned into doing this. Some older, experienced pilots who were gung-ho were ready to go and do it and maybe had to be restrained. But it went all along the spectrum, I think.
Crash diving, however, is not as simple as it may appear on paper. The powerful lift generated from the high winds makes it difficult to keep the nose of an aircraft on target. Also, there is the strong possibility of pilots blacking out from the heavy gravitational forces when they come crashing down. This entire strategy is a huge gamble, but for the Japanese, with their cities being destroyed, it is their only card left to play. By 1944, as the Americans are set to take back the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first waves of kamikaze attacks are unleashed. Before taking off, Admiral Onishi tells his men as they drink sake, "You are already gods, without earthly desires. Your own crash dive is not in vain. Regrettably, we will not be able to tell you the results, but I shall watch your efforts in the end and report your deeds to the throne." On October 25th, a special attack unit led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki spots an American ship, the St. Lo. Diving straight down, his aircraft hits the ship's deck, exploding like a fireball. Going right through its wooden frame, subsequent explosions begin interacting with torpedoes and bombs on board the vessel, and a new chapter in Second World War history begins.
Then it struck. They call it kamikaze, meaning the divine tempest. We call them suicide planes, manned by pilots wearing the ceremonial red sash of the Kamikaze Corps. They specialize in one-way trips. Their destination, the deck or hull of any American ship onto which plane, bombs, burning gasoline, and red-sashed pilot can crash.
Waves of kamikaze attacks are given the green light by Onishi, with targets not being limited to just strictly naval vessels. With the bombardment of Japanese cities by B-29 Superfortresses, orders are given to attack these bombers with the same ferocity. The results prove disappointing. With the B-29's defensive armament that includes remote-controlled gun turrets, kamikaze planes are unable to stop these massive bombers from pulverizing the land of the rising sun.
The Japanese pilots would call them ice castles because they were so far up, and there was no need to camouflage the planes because you weren't. Their elevation was to keep them from having Japanese planes assault them. It was only when tactics changed, when there was a move to more low-level bombing, that the Japanese planes were able to attack them. Even then, there were many instances where the B-29s could actually outrun a Japanese fighter aircraft. It was faster than the aircraft that was trying to pursue them.
And with a scorched earth strategy being carried out, the kamikaze fighter is in a race against the clock. Despite the destruction these tactics are having on American ships, the United States government does not retreat. Their final push to Tokyo will not be derailed, no matter what the cost. So for the next 10 months, American servicemen accept the possibility that today could be their very last.
For the kamikazes, psychologically, I don't think they were prepared at all. It just was such a foreign concept to these young guys, on a ship or in the air, to see somebody who would purposely sacrifice themselves as a way of trying to win a battle. It just was unimaginable to them.
I think that probably the greatest effectiveness of the kamikazes was that it was so incomprehensible to the American military leadership, American society, American understanding. And it did, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was a very real material effect of the kamikaze attacks, but I think the psychological effect really was quite powerful. That it was so hard for American soldiers and sailors and airmen to get their minds around this mentality of people who were willing to do this. And of course, it was very hard to answer. I mean, normally a lot of what air defense and self-defense in general is based on is the idea that this guy is trying to save his life, is trying to avoid being hit, doing something crazy. So it was very hard to answer this.
Hopefully, with the hundreds of guns, rockets, and shells on board destroyers, cruisers, frigates, and battleships, these sailors can shoot down the kamikaze before it is too late. In dealing with this menace, a strategy known as the Big Blue Blanket is employed by naval aviator John Thatch. The plan calls for around-the-clock surveillance by fighter planes over the American fleet, increased attacks on Japanese airfields, and stationing destroyer escorts 50 miles away from the main body to alert the other ships of any approaching Japanese aircraft.
Developing this whole system of radar picket ships that would spot the incoming kamikaze forces, keeping air patrols deployed really around the clock during some of the operations to try to intercept them. So still some did get through. Even in the Battle of Okinawa, it was mainly small ships, American ships, that were sunk. There were no large carriers or battleships that were actually, really put out of action and were sunk by the kamikaze attacks.
This strategy proved successful in disrupting the kamikaze. With Japan in a weakened state, skilled pilots become scarce. As a result, gunmen are finding it easier to shoot down oncoming planes being manned by inexperienced pilots. Despite the toll suicide attacks are taking on soldiers' psyches and lives, most notably on the USS Bunker Hill and the USS Franklin, where hundreds of servicemen are killed, the kamikaze is facing an equally fierce counterstrike.
Ultimately, it was the American military forces were so overwhelmingly powerful, this wasn't going to stop them. It could cause a lot of casualties, it could inflict a lot of pain along the way, but it wasn't sufficient at any point to even derail American strategic decisions. It caused tactical redeployments, it caused an American diversion of forces to try to deal with the kamikazes, but it couldn't alter American strategy.
The attacks reached their zenith during the battle for Okinawa, where hundreds of suicide planes are used in this pivotal conflict.
They did cause a lot of casualties. The climax was probably the Battle of Okinawa, where close to 2,000 kamikaze attacks took place.
A joint order is written by both the Japanese Army and Navy, establishing suicide as an official policy. This results in 30 American ships sunk and 300 badly damaged in the fight for Okinawa. In the end, the United States takes the island, but only after 12,000 American and 110,000 Japanese deaths. The effect of the kamikaze is being felt in Washington, D.C., where military and civilian planners decide what to do with Japan. Even with the unprecedented bombardment of their cities by B-29s, with the death toll being in the hundreds of thousands, the demand for an unconditional surrender is still not being met. Kamikaze missions, in addition to the fierce resistance offered on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, make generals like George Marshall favor the use of an atomic bomb. The Japanese had demonstrated in each case they would not surrender, said the general. We had to end the war. We had to save American lives. Since President Harry Truman takes office following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, American casualties reached nearly half the total of 3 years of battling against the Japanese in just 3 months.
It was something to contemplate. I remember the terrible anxiety through which the people in Washington went, and I was one of them, wondering what would happen when we attempted to take the main islands of Japan.
Conventional wisdom leads the commander-in-chief to believe that the casualties resulting from a mainland invasion of Japan could be enormous, possibly in excess of 1 million men. For that reason, the decision to drop the first atomic bomb in history is approved by the president. On August 6th, the first nuclear weapon in history is used on the city of Hiroshima, and days later, a second bomb is dropped on the city of Nagasaki. After unprecedented carnage, the demand for an unconditional surrender is finally met. With the defeat of the Japanese comes the defeat of the Kamikaze. The impact of these suicide attacks is still hotly debated.
At the time, in 1945, it was seen as a barbarian approach to warfare, an unheard of approach to warfare. 60 years later, you can start to equivocate and say, well, listen, they had to do this. It was in their interest and it was an honorable tactic.
The ships that were sunk as a result of kamikaze planes vary from the mid-30s to the high 50s. Approximately over 4,000 sailors were killed and another 4,000 wounded. However, the entire goal of the kamikaze backfires, causing war planners who may have still been on the fence in terms of whether to drop the atomic bomb or not, to support a nuclear attack on Japan. It was a strategy that grossly underestimated America's resolve in seeking an unconditional surrender from the land of the rising sun. For that reason, no number of suicidal pilots could have stopped the United States' war machine from achieving total victory.
Has there ever been a warplane as mythic as the Mitsubishi Zero? Legend, mystery, and rumor conflated to create an unbeatable fighter flown by samurai tough pilots. The Zero was said to have an awesome performance, superb maneuverability, and combat characteristics in order of magnitude ahead of anything else in the sky. The oft-forgotten fact is that the Zero's effective combat career was measured in months. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero is a long-range carrier-based aircraft fighter formerly manufactured by Mitsubishi Aircraft Company, a part of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and was operated by the Imperial Japanese Navy from 1940 to 1945. The A6M was designated as the Mitsubishi Navy Type 0 carrier fighter, or the Mitsubishi A6M Raisin. The A6M was usually referred to by its pilots as the Raisin, or Zero, being the last digit of the imperial year 2600, or 1940, when it entered the service with the Imperial Navy. In the official designation A6M, the A signified a carrier-based fighter, 6 meant that it was the 6th such model built for the Imperial Navy, and M indicated Mitsubishi as the manufacturer. The official Allied report name was Zeke, although the name Zero was used colloquially as well. Not counting its earliest sucker punch missions over China, when the best-trained fighter pilots in the world swatted down scores of ill-flown Polikarpov biplanes and open-cockpit monoplanes. The Zero resigned supreme in the Pacific War, only from the day of the Pearl Harbor attack until American pilots learned the tactics that allowed even pudgy F-4F Wildcats to level the aerial playing field during the Guadalcanal campaign in the summer and fall of 1942. When the second generation of U.S. World War II fighters, the P-38, F4U, and F6F arrived beginning in early 1943, the Zero was finished as an effective fighter. In January 1944, a single Marine F4U pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, shot down 20 Zeros in just 17 days. The Zero soldiered on until the end of the war. Of course, many self-immolating as kamikazes, but only because the Japanese had nothing to replace it, and the Zero often was simply a cannon fodder. The June 1944 Marianas Turkey shoot is the most notorious example of such inequity. Not that the Zero wasn't still dangerous even in the 1945s, especially if an aviator was cocky enough to try to dogfight one of the few remaining experienced Zero pilots. Nobody ever built a fighter that could outmaneuver it, and the fact that Grumman developed the F-8F Bearcat as Zero beater, a task that it was to do just a bit too late to fulfill, shows that the Zero was never entirely disdained. The Japanese had counted on a short, brutal war to force the US to the negotiating table in order to establish unfettered area of Japanese exploitation in South Asia and the Pacific. So Japan had done little to prepare for a protracted conflict. Zero pilots were superbly trained, but only hundreds at a time. Then a few thousand a year while the US was turning tens of thousands of college grads into pilots. The great majority of Japanese pilots were the equivalent of our NCOs. Nor was the production of a Zero successful given high priority. Much like the German High Command initially assumed the Me-109 would suffice for the duration of the war and that it didn't need an engineer or a successor, The Japanese waited too long to develop and produce the Shiden, Raiden, and Reppu, or perhaps they should have developed just one of them. It didn't help that Japan, a small island nation with limited engineering and manufacturing manpower, spent its time dithering over the development of more than 90 major combat types as well as several dozen lesser models. By the time they did get serious, raw materials were lacking and the country's skilled airframe and engine workforce had fled the manufacturing centers due to being bombed out of their homes. The Zero was incrementally improved throughout the war, from the A6M2, the first model to take on American fighters, to the A6M8. Only 2 ever built, intended to attack B-29s. The Zero's excellent Nakajima-built Sake engine was eventually upgraded by about 150 horsepower, but it never attained anything like the horsepower offered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800, the P-38's twin Allisons, or the P-51's Packard Merlin. The Zero's power-to-weight ratio was always better than that of its US opponents, but sheer horsepower allowed the Americans to loft superior firepower, substantial armor, and overbuilt airframes. What the Japanese needed and never got was not a better Zero, but an all-new fighter, a Japanese Hellcat. When the war ended and the Zero stood down, the US was within a week of introducing yet a third generation of Pacific fighters in the form of the Bearcat. The Zero began the Pacific War with an aura of invincibility. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, 521 Zeros were active in the Pacific, 328 in first-line units. The carrier-borne Model 21 was the type encountered by the Americans. Its tremendous range, over 2,600 kilometers, allowed it to range farther from its carrier than expected, appearing over distant battlefronts and giving Allied commanders the impression that there were several times as many Zeros as actually existed. After Pearl Harbor, it quickly became to be viewed as some kind of mystery ship, imbued with strange powers, able to do things that no other airplane could. Yet it was simply a well-engineered, straightforward, optimized aircraft for maneuverability, and flown against an enemy that had never credited the Japanese with the ability to design a cutting-edge fighter. Even though the Claire Chennault of Flying Tigers had been sent back to the US, reports of the airplane's capability over China, they were ignored, and American aircraft recognition manuals didn't even include a picture of the Zero. As aviation historian William Green wrote, the Zero created a myth, the myth of a Japanese invincibility in the air. Its successive appearance over every major battle area in the opening days of the war seemed to indicate that the Japanese possessed unlimited supplies of this remarkable fighter. And its almost mystical powers of maneuver and ability to traverse vast stretches of water fostered the acceptance of a myth of its invincibility in Allied minds. Zeros often showed up so far from the nearest Japanese-controlled land that the Americans set out in search of the carrier from which it was assumed they'd taken off. The Zero was designed by a team under the direction of the brilliant young aeronautical engineer Jiro Horikoshi. Mitsubishi had the foresight to send Horikoshi to work and observe at aircraft factories in Europe and in the US in 1929, and he even spent several months at Curtiss Plant in New York as an acceptance inspector for a batch of P-6 Hawk pursuit biplanes the Japanese had ordered. Horikoshi had already engineered the Mitsubishi A5M, later codenamed the Claude by the Allies. For an open cockpit, fixed-gear fighter, the A5M displayed outstanding performance, in no small part because of its flush riveting, a production technique that the Japanese would subsequently use on the Zero at a time when American airframers were just discovering its low-drag advantage. In order to fight not only the already overmatched Chinese, but also the Pacific War against the US that was beginning to look inevitable, however, Japan still needed something more than just the Claude. The Japanese would never have attacked Pearl Harbor if they didn't have the Zero. At the time, in fact, some planners had misgivings that there weren't yet enough Zeros available for the attack to succeed. When the Japanese Navy gave Mitsubishi its marching orders as the Zero design began, it demanded a triple threat: an escort with the extreme range that needed to accompany bombers deep into China and later to cover over vast Pacific distances, a point defense interceptor with a rapid rate of climb to hit attacking bombers before they reached their targets, and a consummate dogfighter with extreme maneuverability. Though it's often assumed that the Japanese Army Air Force also flew Zeros, it never did. Another Zero oddity is that though all Japanese naval aviators were carrier qualified, many, including the famous Zero super ace Saburo Sakai, never operated from a carrier in combat. The extreme range criterion resulted in one piece of a little acknowledged pioneering for which the Zero was responsible. It was the first airplane designed from inception to carry an ejectable external fuel tank. A Zero's maximum fuel load, including the belly tank, typically was about 230 gallons. And this, gave it 7 or 8 hours of combat endurance. Sakai set the Zero endurance record, just over 12 hours, by throttling back to 1,700 RPM and running what today we'd call lean of peak, maximum height exhaust gas temperature, at just 130 miles an hour. He intentionally ran his tanks bone dry while circling above Formosa Air Base after a mission and dead-sticked in from 8,000 feet. Another Zero innovation was its 360-degree view cockpit canopy, second only to the British Westland Whirlwind's bubble canopy. Though it was a multi-pane greenhouse rather than a true bubble, the Zero's glassware provided a considerably better rearward view than anything but a true open cockpit design, and had also excellent drag-reducing properties. It could also be opened in flight but not jettisoned, making parachute egress difficult. It was assumed that a Zero samurai would continue fighting to their death rather than bail out. Most Zero pilots refueled to wear parachutes in any case, until they ultimately were ordered to strap them on. In the late 1930s, the Japanese had developed nothing more powerful than several 800 to 1000 HP radials with little grown potential. At a time when American, British, and German manufacturers were cranking out 1,200 horsepower engines with 2,000 horsepower visible on the horizon. So Horikoshi needed to make his new fighter super light, which he did in part by having lightened holes cut and drilled through every internal airframe part possible, a technique that race car builders would recognize immediately. Horikoshi also persuaded the Navy to change its ultimate load standards for many components he didn't consider crucial. He designed them to fail, but then rebound them to previous shape as soon as they were reduced. As a result, the Zero was the fastest 1000 HP radial engine fighter ever produced, but one with a number of single-point failure locations that, if hit, could bring down the airplane. The Zero was skinned with the lightest gauge aluminum possible, and when the shadows were right, some photos of the Zeros in flight show them seemingly clothed in crinkled tinfoil. British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew a captured Zero immediately after the war, even today recalls the constant noise of the oil canning fuselage skin, like the sound produced when one pushes on the side of a large biscuit tin. A typical Zero, loaded with full fuel and ordnance, weighed about 5,500 pounds, less than a mid-sized Cessna twin. A fully loaded Hellcat weighed over twice as much. The single heaviest component of any airframe is the main wing spar. Horikoshi lightened the Zeros by 30% by using a new zinc aluminum alloy called Super Ultra Duraluminum, which had recently been developed by Sumitomo Metals. One major benefit of the 7075 over the Sumitomo metal was that it was very corrosion resistant. In another weight-saving measure, the Zero's main spar was continuous, from wingtip to wingtip, and thus was an inseparable part of the fuselage center section rather than having a left and right wing, each bolted to the fuselage. This eliminated the weight of fasteners and spar buckets. Though it might seem that permanently affixed wings could make a Zero difficult to transport, Horikoshi had designed the entire tail cone and empennage to easily unbolt just aft of the cockpit. With everything removed forward of the firewall as well, the wing and cockpit became a single long but light narrow truckload. Horikoshi's search for lightness led him to the oft-criticized failure to include adequate armor or self-sealing fuel tanks in the Zero design. What was forgotten, however, is that virtually no fighters at the time the Zero was introduced had such features. It remained for the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 to demonstrate the need for armor and protected tanks. In any case, the Zero's designers considered armor unnecessary because they didn't think anybody would be able to put any rounds into the fighter. Maybe a lucky shot here and there, but not enough of a danger to compromise the design's lightness. Little did they know what the Navy and Marines had in store for them. Most combat units also removed their Zero's radios for additional weight savings, since the Japanese transceiver was very poor quality. This left the Zero pilots unable to warn wingmen of surprise attacks, and they could coordinate their own attacks only with occasional hand signals. A typical multi-plane Zero attack was a melee of individual aerobatics, and Japanese pilots were in nearly as much danger of mid-airs with their mates as they were of getting shot at. As one of the USN pilots put it, from the way Zero pilots rollicked around in the sky, at times, it looked as they would rather stunt than fly. Yokonawa flew upside down, having both hands around the cockpit, wrote Sakai in his book Samurai. Then, he flew directly over me, under me, and went through a wide hesitation roll around my fighter. He was like a kid showing off. He finally flew on my wing and held the stick between his knees. Still grinning, he waved his lunchbox at me and started to eat. The Zero's flight controls mix some ingenious engineering with at least one awkward feature. Its ailerons were large and powerful, which added greatly to the fighter's low-speed maneuverability and spectacular roll rate, but they were very difficult to deflect at high speeds. American pilots soon learned to dive and turn sharply, especially to the right, which substantial prop-induced torque made particularly difficult for the Zero when they had a Zero on their tail. Horikoshi did an interesting job with the Zero's elevator, however. The airplane's speed range was broad, from low-speed maneuvering to flat-out dashes at more than 300 miles an hour, and elevator effectiveness, of course, increased with speed, to the point where it could become quite touchy. So Horikoshi designed an elastic control system,